Every exploration of the old world always opens us up to new possibilities, and yet we haven't really considered the dark side of the old world. These other accounts that conflict with the accounts that we have of incredible buildings and a remarkable balanced civilization. Yet we have to consider these darker accounts. We have to consider the fact that the old world was corrupted in its own way, and that there are accounts that do corroborate that corruption. Join me today as we explore these accounts and explore. It seems rather odd to think of the old world as a dark place or a place where horrors may occur with all the wonderful structures that we look at during our explorations. Yet we have to consider this account because we do see the representation of these darker accounts. And today we're going to explore these various accounts and see what they are. It's not for the timid. In the past, we've looked at the greater glories of Tartaria. We've explored what it may have looked like, and these are just theories because the reality is we have no idea exactly what it looked like. But we have a good idea of what it may have looked like based on the remaining architectural examples that we have that endured to our own civilization in the 5th era. And yet, for whatever reason, the civilization of the 4th era, what we call Tartaria on this channel, is a civilization that we find very alluring. We also find that many of the greatest achievements in humanity and its history seem to be reflected in Tartaria and the actual intention behind this civilization, which was to achieve balance within the individual, but also to achieve balance between the individual, the cities, and nature. It's certainly something that we can see in our current civilization that we tend not to have balance, at least not a balance that we can recognize. We oftentimes see ourselves being moved to polar opposites on any and every issue, whether it's the differences in our ideology or our appearances or even our economic systems. And as a result of our deference to this type of conflict, we see our civilization in ruins. We see the ruins of the previous civilization of Tartaria. We know that it was a great civilization that had achieved wondrous heights, a unity of purpose within humanity. But how exactly did it fall? In the past, we posited who was truly responsible, and we came to a little bit of a conclusion that perhaps we were responsible, or at least our progenitors were responsible. Yet, looking deeper into the history of Tartaria, I think we can still see the very forces and their effects in our current civilization that caused the fall of the previous civilization. If you think about what every civilization aspires to be and do, it's to grow and to increase in size and knowledge. And while the people of Tartaria looked within themselves, they sought more lands to explore. There are accounts in this that they opened portals to other lands, that they attempted to access areas that they didn't have access to. In effect, they had reached the physical boundaries of their realm or their lands, and they sought to explore others. It was in this exploration, though, that they opened a portal to a dark land, and they allowed some other dark beings to reach their land through this portal. By the time that they had realized what they had opened up, they found themselves facing an entity with a power that they couldn't even begin to imagine. An entity that seemed to reflect some sort of anti-deity, or an anti-god, if you will. This anti-god quickly filled the land and turned the people of Tartaria against themselves. But how was this achieved? What happened that caused the great civilization that was unified in purpose, that had achieved balance, to completely fall apart and ultimately be destroyed? We can still see the remnants of Tartaria everywhere we look across the lands. Castles, ruins, some buildings that are kept in better shape than others, and even older remnants of the buildings of previous eras. When we look at our 5 eras theory, we start with our contemporary era because that's where we are now. And we examine all of the aspects of our contemporary era. People will tell you that some things don't apply to Tartaria and some things do, but the reality is everything does. Because we are descended, we are the progeny of the civilizations that came before us.
It doesn't matter if there were 4 resets, 5 resets, or 2,000 resets. We are still the same people. It's safe to say that there have been vast changes within both ourselves and our civilization and the society. When we look at the fourth era, the Tartarian civilization, we examine their great triumph. But now we're going to look at the decline and fall. How did this great civilization erode and disintegrate, ultimately turn upon itself, and then found itself isolated and destroyed by the forces that it had exposed itself to in its attempts to explore new lands, to access other lands. And we can see the great tragedy of the destruction of the once great examples of architecture. And we can see the remnants of it, even perhaps in some of the images that we have that perhaps were not altered from the 19th century. The height of the fourth era, or the Tartarian civilization, is something that we believe dreams are composed of. It's very difficult to properly imagine or visualize exactly what these images were in this civilization. The finest examples of architecture and society working together, people achieving balance, looking inward for internal strength, and most importantly, possessing self-discipline. What we know as our paradigm in our current civilization is that we have external discipline. In other words, external institutions, individuals enforce discipline upon us. We do not seek to be self-disciplined. We tend to be discouraged from seeking self-discipline. And what this leads to is when you rely on another force, authority, or individual to impose discipline upon you, it means that that entity is ultimately dictating how you're going to live your life. They're going to tell you what's important, and they're going to do it in the most insidious ways possible. Even though you may be consciously aware of it, even though you may see it, and you write about it and you lament about it every day of your life, you're oftentimes willing to accept it because you've been conditioned to accept it. You've been conditioned that there can be nothing better in the past, or that in the past everything just fell apart because the previous civilization was corrupt. And indeed, a lot of what we're allowed to or encouraged to explore when it comes to a previous civilization was the ways in which it was corrupt. Because you'll see that the corruption is reflected in our current civilization, and even in our supposed recorded mainstream account, you will find the examples of corruption. Yet contrast that with what we see as the dream of Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. And that dream is a people who had self-discipline, who had self-restraint, and yet at the same time achieved balance. They were able to overcome their physical differences and all the other differences and live in a state of balance. Now, of course, this has to be mocked, this has to be derided, because this is a threat to the current power structure that we have in our Fifth Era civilization. No one is supposed to know that they have greater capabilities as an individual, that they have spiritual strength which cannot be matched in any way, shape, or form. Yet looking at the examples that we have of the fourth civilization, with the great achievements in architecture, we'll be told that somebody else had to do this. It was a divine being, or it was some form of artificial intelligence, which nowadays seems to be a substitute for a divine being for many. And if that's what you choose to believe, then so be it. But we have to remember that many of the greatest works of art that depict the wonders of the past came from a human being. It came from a human's creative inspiration. The tales of fantasy did not come from some artificial intelligence. They came from human creativity, the spirituality within every single human being that no doubt comes from some sort of divine power. And while I may not have spoken of it directly in the past in the channel, I've certainly alluded to it. And the reality is, our search for understanding and who we are comes from within. It does not come without. And ultimately, that was the great mistake. That was the mistake that was made in the past that led to the eventual destruction and downfall of Tartaria. When you look at all the myths and all the examples of what may have been in the past, even that does not match the grandeur for what was in reality. Because we can look across the lands and we can see great examples of horrific destruction in Siberia, in the northeastern portion of Siberia. And we'll have a designated historical account that'll tell us what was there, and will tell us about the great kingdoms that were there. But I don't believe that at the height of its civilization that a person, a citizen of Tartaria, the civilization, or whatever it was actually called, because remember that we just use that name as a placeholder because we don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what exactly they called their civilization or how they divided their lands, and perhaps they didn't divide their lands at all. They didn't believe in such a concept. It's always interesting when you look at the concepts of certain cultures that we're told believed in boundaries on land, but then conversely we're told that they did not believe in the boundaries of land, that land had no boundaries, that land was for everyone. Now you might be arguing, well, how could anybody live in such a system where there's no division? Well, somehow we manage to live in cities now where there's no actual division, although we believe there's a division of ownership. Is it real, or is it just what we accept? These are all questions that we have to explore. We also look at the concept of Camelot and King Arthur and the legend of Excalibur. I believe that that particular myth alludes to what was very likely the last legitimate regime of Tartaria, or the civilization that preceded ours. It was not based upon one person's vanity, or one person acting as king. Yes, there was King Arthur, but King Arthur didn't see himself as some sort of divine monarch. What he ultimately saw himself as was a person who worked for the betterment of the entire civilization. That was indeed the very crux of the idea of the Round Table. That everyone was equal, no one was above any other, and that the role of being the leader was simply a function. It was not some sort of near divine being that was to be worshipped. Ultimately, Arthur sacrificed himself for what was and the dream of what could be. And it's those very words that we have to remember. Things were once very great in the past, and they could be very great in the future. The way things were subverted was by kings and titles. Once the entity that managed to infiltrate Tartarian civilization, or the Fourth Era civilization, grabbed hold, one of the first things it seemed to do was to subvert individuals. And where that started was many individuals taking the title of king. How much do we value the title of king? How much do you see the use of king this and king that? King Charles, King Henry, King Charles the Simple, King Charlemagne. It goes on, although Charlemagne had himself declared emperor. It doesn't really matter because what you have is this obsession almost with titles. Now, before anybody says that I'm degrading anybody who puts value in titles, that's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is that when you embrace the importance of titles, you have to be cautious because before you know it, you are suddenly putting the certification of a larger group on your own self-value. In other words, the titles that endure to this day. I remember there was a political science teacher during his class who was explaining to his students that we don't use titles in the United States anymore. For example, you would call me Lord Schmidt if we still use titles. And then one of the students quite accurately quipped, yes, but we still have to call you Dr. Schmidt. Everybody got a good chuckle out of that, including myself. But what it says, though, is that if you value titles over your own individual value, then you're letting someone else dictate what your value is. And that is not what life is about. We dictate our own value. And no matter how many people try to tell you fallacies, how many people try to convince you that they're doing the right thing, or whoever dresses up in kingly robes with their wonderful adornments and decorations, there really is no difference between one human being or another. And one of the other things that caused the Fourth Era civilization to fall apart was not just the embracing of titles and indulgence and self-vanity. It was also the change in identity. What we saw was suddenly a more increased political division, a geographical division within the lands, dividing up the lands into many different principalities, and suddenly changing the ways in which they were facilitated, and even embracing the concept of being governed. If you have a people who are self-disciplined, what need is there for governance? But if you have a people who are not self-disciplined and have to be disciplined by an external force, then you have every great need for governance, which involves individuals taking the titles of king and dressing up in all the pageantry that you can imagine, with flowing robes and very nice tights, And we have room for queens too, or it doesn't really matter. Anybody can call themselves a king. It doesn't matter what your gender or your background is, or it's interesting how it even transcends cultures, that pretty much anybody can be declared a king for any point in time, or an emperor. And indeed, many of the symbols of this endure to this day. So what you have that's been effectively undermined, and what was no doubt effectively undermined in the Fourth Era civilization, was the concept of leadership. Instead of a leader seeing themselves as a servant of the people, they looked to themselves as divine beings. The defense forces of Tartaria were subverted as well. Now, I've long had an exploration looking into the military orders that we have of the medieval period, and not just focused on Europe, but all the other military orders across the lands. Yet, we can see a great example in the military orders that we believe are associated with Europe, even though they operated extensively in what is today the Middle East, such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights Hospitaller, all the other military orders that we have. The one that tends to get the most attention, though, is the Knights Templar. What we're told about the Knights Templar in our official history is that they were a military order that was founded for the Crusades, for the European or the Latin nations, as they were called at that time, to recapture the Holy Land for Christendom. And in their foundation, though, we seem to have views of chastity, views of poverty, and that they were specifically dedicated to their mission. But the Knights Templar, unfortunately, according to the official account, decided to embrace the concept of wealth, and that they were, in effect, one of the early banking systems, at least according to the official history, that presided over Europe, and as a result of which they were targeted and destroyed by the monarch of France, again according to the official history. And yet, if we look at how they operated, the Knights Templar, if they had stayed true to their original vows, what was closer? What was closer to the original concept of the once great military that defended Tartaria or the Fourth Era civilization? I believe it was the original vows and concepts of chivalry. And I've noticed that when you study this, when you study the official historical account of medieval history, you'll be told that knights only applied chivalry to noble ladies and nobility. They didn't apply it to anybody else. But what if it did apply to everyone? What if the reality was the concept of chivalry, the concept of humility, of actually embracing and defending others, did universally apply to everyone? How much does that change these military orders in our eyes, if that's what they were truly about? And over time they became subverted. Much in the same way that the leaders of Tartaria were subverted, these knights became subverted and suddenly began to embrace the importance of material possessions, and not just money, but even the idea of money. Strangely enough, the very same things that we contend with every day. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of material possessions in and of themselves are bad. Like everything else, it's how we deal with things. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by anything, whether it's material possessions, love, or anything, it can cause us to do things that we would not do otherwise. Because suddenly we start to value the idea of this over our own self-discipline. We lose our self-identity. And if you look at the things that we contend with every day, it seems as though everything is directed towards keeping us from understanding our true selves. And this is very true when we look at the official historical account of the Knights Templar. This is a military order that had a very noble purpose and seemed to have a very noble method, a methodology behind how they lived true to that noble purpose and those values. Indeed, the Knights Templars are viciously derided as evil, or the antagonists, in the novel Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. You might remember we looked at the Scott Monument when we did our exploration in Scotland. It's a very striking monument that supposedly depicts characters. This is the original depiction of the Knights Templar. 2 knights riding 1 horse, and the reason being because they were impoverished. That was one of their essential vows. Very similar to the Franciscan monastic order in Christianity, that they embraced poverty. And yet there is a conflicting account that says that these Knights Templar devolved into concepts of violence, and they believed in violence and engaging in acts of violence, and that became more important to them, in addition to their valuing the idea of money above all else. And you can find a similar account with the Teutonic Knights, who supposedly took in the remnants of the Knights Templar and then continued their so-called colonization efforts into what is today Prussia. It's very interesting, and this is all the official historical account. Yet, again, there are conflicting accounts that say that these military orders once had a more noble purpose, that knights truly did live true to the concept of chivalry, and that it didn't just apply to a select few in the population, but it applied equally to everyone. So what's reality and what's merely the blended fiction? It's hard to say. And that's all by design. We're not supposed to have a clear account of the civilization that preceded us. Indeed, you're encouraged, and it's quite okay to talk about the Knights Templar once they had devolved. There's an interesting episode of Robin of Sherwood, yes, that show again, that I think tells the entire story of the Knights Templar in one single episode. It's called 7 Poor Knights from Acre. And in that story, Robin Hood and his band of outlaws come across a group of Knights Templar, 7 knights, who had a small object, a gold object that was a depiction of the order of the Knights Templar stolen from them by this individual. As a result of this, the Knights Templar seek to find the individual responsible, kill him, and then reacquire their material item that supposedly means everything to their honor. And in the process of doing so, they kill many innocent people trying to retrieve this object, and they even kill a member of Robin's band. And Robin himself has to actually engage in hand-to-hand combat, single combat with one of the knights to try to save one of the other members of his band. It's a very well-written story, and it's very interesting how within an hour they managed to summarize the exact progress of the Knights Templar. How they went from being a monastic order that was dedicated to the defense of a society to an order that was self-serving. Supposedly it was about their honor, but the reality is it was about the material item that had monetary value. That's why they went on this little quest near Nottingham, and why they killed innocent people, and why they attempted to terrorize Robin Hood and the outlaws. They even ran afoul of the sheriff and Guy of Gisborne, although the sheriff, acting on his own opportunistic notions, tells Guy to stand down and allow the Knights Templar to hunt Robin and the band of outlaws. Because why do it when they could have someone else do it for them? In the end, Robin Hood prevails, and I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. The knights are stripped of the armor, and then they're sent off on one horse. And you can see that the 2 knights here, without their armor, do actually reflect what's supposed to be the ideal concept for the Knights Templar. 2 knights riding on one horse. I'd missed that when I initially viewed the episode, but upon rewatch for this exploration, I saw the truth in that. And that's what it reflects. It doesn't just reflect that truth for military orders, leaders, or monastic orders. Consider that Tartaria was carved into successor states, ruled by kings. And these are the aspects of Tartaria we're supposed to talk about. And you'll find 3 greater Tartaries or Tartarias all over the map in many different locations. We also have the accounts of madness that gripped the previous civilization. And there's no doubt that there were some people who tried to live true to the values of self-discipline, and they ran afoul of the compromised leaders and military orders, some of which who still acted in accordance with the rules of the old civilization, and others that didn't. And this is likely why we have these accounts of all these strange sicknesses, such as the dancing plague and many other bizarre accounts from our supposed incorruptible mainstream historical account. But I do think there's a lot of truth to this. There is a lot of truth into the history that we are able to see. But what seems to be the consistent reality is that we're only supposed to see the previous civilization as being a failure. We're supposed to question ourselves, and we're supposed to feel helpless, and the last thing we're ever supposed to develop is a sense of self-discipline, a sense of the ability of exploring ourselves and finding our own spiritual strength from within. You need to rely on other institutions. You need to have other people tell you what to do. When you look at how the lands were carved up and divided politically, you notice that as maps become newer, these political boundaries become more prevalent. They're a lot easier to see. Why is that? Why is it on older maps it seems as though there are no true political boundaries? Why do these accounts of mass insanity and hysteria seem to increase in certain times? What makes more sense? Was there really just all these isolated incidences of mass panic going on? Or was it really a population that was trying to struggle to find itself, to understand why their entire civilization was collapsing, why the leaders that they had trusted had suddenly turned against them, and were constantly keeping them turned against one another. Why was the great defense force that they had once relied on suddenly turning to materialism and not living true to the values that they always had? It had to be a very frightening experience for them, and no doubt many did try to find their way back to their own self-internal images, and yet at the same time, they found the people that they had relied on turning against them. And it's safe to say that this mentality, this primary method of operation, continues to this day. It is very easy to keep people turned against one another, and you can find any variety of reasons to turn people against one another. And I have no doubt that even in the grand heritage of the previous civilization, that some groups were told that they were more responsible for the achievements than other groups. It's another way. It's more of a positive way that you can turn people against one another. You can say that some people are more responsible for others for achievements than others. You can then say that those people who are not more responsible are the outcasts from society. They're people who shouldn't be listened to. You can use any number of means to reinforce this. You can use financial incentives, you can use patronage, and you'll see it every day. And no doubt this has been with us longer than we can begin to imagine. That is how the previous civilization ultimately collapsed. How it broke down into successor states, corrupted by the very forces of evil, corrupted from the inside and the outside, disintegrating and eroding, until finally it became vulnerable. Vulnerable by the very forces that it had unfortunately encountered. In its exploration for more land to explore, they had unleashed a great evil. An evil that destroyed them from the inside. And there's no doubt that there are concepts of this evil that remain with us to this day. And you don't have to look very far or very hard to see examples of it. Can it be overcome? Well, the reality is, it's still unchanged from when King Arthur said it. Defend what was and the dream of what could be. There is still a very powerful dream of what could be. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Welcome and thank you for joining me for today's theory video into the fall of Tartaria. I thought it was important to look at how Tartaria could have fallen. We've talked about it before and after the reset. We've never really looked though at what the civilization looked like aside from a few vision photos. Today though, I want to consider the theories for how it fell. But to start off, I want to share the approach of the channel. The channel seeks to explore these theories to prove or disprove them. Always maintain objectivity, the hardest part. Reveal and share details of the land with all viewers. Encourage you to seek your own answers, and keep asking questions and we will find the truth. Let's go back to the 5 eras theory, which is what we're looking at. And today we're going to be focusing exclusively on the Tartarian Age, or the civilization that preceded ours, in the 4th era. Recall that it's surrounded by the Golden Age, which we believe consisted of 3 eras, or at least the channel has theorized that, and then followed by our current contemporary age, also derisively called the Plastic Age, the Disposable Age by other researchers, which I certainly agree with. We don't know how long the Tartarian Age truly lasted. It could have been a few hundred years, it could have been a few thousand years, it could have been over 10,000 years. What we know is they had incredible accomplishments in architecture, society, and civilization. And oftentimes we're derided for even suggesting such theories because we are told and reassured that our civilization is the pinnacle of humanity. Yet we see so much evidence that contradicts that when we look at images of what Tartaria could have looked like. And yes, I'll admit Tartaria is a term that we use to refer to the civilization before us. It has many different names. We're expected to believe that there was a civilization called Rome that lasted 1,000 years despite being very corrupt and despite every significant leader in that civilization betraying the other leader. Yet when we look at this civilization of Tartaria, our imaginations are inspired, our hearts are lifted, because in every depiction of it we see a society that managed to work together and achieve balance in a way that we really can't imagine. And when we say achieving balance, what do we mean? Is that just a plug line? Is that just a saying? No. What we see is a civilization that achieved balance between the society and the individual. There was a great society, and yet at the same time, it did care and nurture for the individual. That is the true balance that we see. And this is how you can explain different civilizations, different cultures with different languages working together and achieving a common civilization, because there was a mutual understanding between the goods of society and the good of the individual. There was always something given and something returned on both sides. And we look at what their achievements were and could have been, and we see the remnants of it even today in our own civilization. And that's why we ask these questions. This is something that inspires us just to think about their achievements and how far their society and their civilization really could have gone. It's not just architecture, though. There are still remnants of this everywhere within our own civilization. Many people struggle to accept this, and they will certainly deny it and deride it in any way that they can. Yet, if your eyes are open, you'll see that so much of it remains. Just imagine living in that kind of civilization, one that really cared for the individual as much as the individual cared for society. That was the true balance. We have to wonder if the story or myth of the Tower of Babel was not simply about the languages being confused. Perhaps it was really about the understanding between people and the balance being confused. And that was where the real breakdown started. In this video, we're seeking to explain who or what was responsible for the fall of this incredible civilization. And this is something that compels us in all this research. This video is based on theory and conjecture because ultimately none of us know. The records are lost. We don't have something of an account that we can truly rely on. We have to go off of our research. We have to compare and contrast all the clues that we find. And there are still many clues that you can go out and interact with today physically. There are accounts in the myth, and then of course examining the historical accounts that were given. There's also a bit of a blending between what's real, what may be considered fantasy, and what you can still go interact with, such as the Great Water Tower column that still exists in St. Louis today, in the middle. And yet you compare and contrast those with a fantasy rendering on the left, and then what's supposed to be a concept architectural rendering on the right. Yet for some reason all this feels real. All of this seems like it's something that could have existed and could have been a part of our actual history. And once again, people will deny this and say, well, it's just a water tower. There's nothing special about it. So what if it's over 150 feet tall? Yet we look at other conceptualized drawings in our imagination where we see large hangars and incredible technology, inspired by what's called steampunk. Yet somehow it feels so familiar to us, as though this is something that truly existed in our own history. It doesn't seem like it's that disconnected. We also see the incredible hangars and the remarkable buildings that could have contained such devices. We also have so much imagination for the different methods of travel that could have been used and connected such a civilization. Travel on the ground, travel in the air, travel below ground, with many different means, whether it was airships or other aspects that we can't even imagine. Some of these structures clearly still remain, with all the Union stations and their tall ceilings and all their incredible hardened construction on the inside with materials we can't imagine. Yet we have to accept the fact that the civilization is no longer with us, that it was lost. But why was it lost? This video, we're not seeking to point the finger at any particular group of people, because the theories that we're going to propose involve what happened with the previous civilization. And I believe that we do far too much of trying to blame one particular group of people for why we're in the situation we're in. We're going to look at three options, and the first one is we made it happen. The corruption that is inherent within human beings, and many of the myth stories that we have say that we grew too arrogant in our abilities. It's possible this same aspect could have struck the previous civilization. They attempted to do something using their science or their balance of science with nature to go even further in their capabilities. And in the prospect of doing so, they created a great disaster.
Was this disaster or some combination of natural and artificial forces that brought about some sort of plasma rain that destroyed the entire civilization? We have many accounts of what appear to be meteorites, although we know they could have many different explanations, striking cities, whether it's Sodom and Gomorrah or whether it's the Peshtigo fire that may have had something to do with what happened to Chicago. We just don't know. We don't know exactly where these events happened in history, and yet at the same time, there are far too many accounts of this to truly ignore. There are far too many images of this to ignore. So we go back to the explanation that it was simply us. Our pride grew with our ability. We saw what a great civilization that we could build. We saw our achievements, and we wanted to see how far we could actually take it. Then we also consider the other stories that we have of a great deluge or a massive flood. Now we'll be told that this flood was caused by some deity, and it may well have been. Yet there's other accounts that say that a deluge may have destroyed a civilization, such as the legend of Atlantis, because, again, it grew corrupt in the fact that all they pursued were their abilities, and wanting to expand their abilities beyond what they knew were their limits. And as a result of that, it caused the destruction of their civilization in a way that they weren't able to recover from. And this doesn't just appear from myth, but we also see this reflected in fiction, science fiction, and fantasy today. Think of the stories of old Valyria from the Song of Ice and Fire and how it was destroyed. It was all from the same cause, because the people and the civilization grew corrupt internally, and they sought to expand themselves beyond their natural bounds, and they paid a heavy price for it. Then there's also the concept of conflict, and perhaps the previous civilization simply broke down. The once great threads that were so strong that held that civilization together fell apart. They had achieved too much, and as we always see reflected in our current civilization, there was one group that felt that it was more important than another group and exploited whatever minor or major differences. Ultimately, if we think about it, there are very few differences between human beings. And yet at the same time, those same differences could have been exploited in the past for those seeking power. It is again a recurring theme and a recurring story that we have to face. It's not perhaps the most inspiring of stories, but it is true that this could have been how Tartaria fell, that the civilization had reached its ascendant over hundreds or even thousands of years, and finally it began to fall apart, because they had expanded themselves too far, or they had simply been around to the point where some people believe they could have more. Theory 2, we were corrupted to make it happen. We have many allusions to the fact that there are corruptions within human beings that could have happened from some external force that we can't fully understand. There's a lot of evidence for this in the fact that in our myth and even to contemporary times, we see that the greatest battle seems to be for a person's soul. And it's not just a plug line. There's so much effort that's put into influencing people what to do, what to think, and what to believe. As though we wish to deny people their true individuality and give them an individuality through some other sort of belief set. We have to wonder if this isn't something that's imposed by some sort of external force that we don't fully understand. Because it always seems that in myth and even in fantasy and other accounts, the greatest stories of the greatest civilizations always fall because they become internally corrupted or decadent. Now, this varies from the first theory, and the first theory that we just believe that this is completely internal and this is just human nature. Whereas the second theory indicates that this is some sort of external force that somehow manages to exploit the natural aspects of human existence and ultimately turn human beings against one another. We have other images where we see once corrupted human beings begin to fight each other and then begin to destroy their civilization. They believe that they are acting in the name of righteousness, they are righting past wrongs, or they are simply acting in the name of their survival. And yet every time we have so many stories, and it's such a repeated and recurring story, where we see the people more than willing to inflict horrific acts against one another, all in the name of righteousness. We see that buildings are destroyed, and much, much worse, so many people are killed, all because others are told that it needed to happen. It was necessary. And how many people ever stop and simply ask a simple question as to why they are told to do such actions? Oftentimes we look at the vast levels of indoctrination. And yet in these images, we see what can happen when people are motivated to this extent. We see the great human spirit suddenly applied to something very malevolent, and done so without any hesitation, time and time again. We also see this depicted so many times in movies, plots, stories, novels, in our myth. It's all over the place. Until finally, the civilization reaches a point to where it's so corrupted that the internal and the external forms of human beings no longer resemble human beings. They resemble some sort of creature. Now, is this really a physical representation of what happened, or is this just simply an interpretation of people corrupting themselves, that this is what they would look like if you were able to see how they were corrupted? We don't see human beings anymore. We see ghastly apparitions all over the land. And we see the fact that there's no limits to what they're willing to do. They are completely and totally overwhelmed and controlled by their simple desire to survive and to consume anything and everything that is around them. And it's a story that's repeated so many times. And here we see the final transformation of human beings into these horrific creatures. There's many different names for them: demons, dark angels, horrific apparitions that we can't even begin to imagine. Yet it appears in every single society. It appears in every single myth that this can happen to human beings to where they can become corrupted. You'll see slight variations in what the names are for these creatures or the processes by which this happens. And yet when we step far enough back and we look at this in totality, we see that this is the exact same story, repeated time and time again. And I believe there's a lot of strong evidence for this theory, that there are forces that seek to corrupt us, both as individuals, as groups, and overall as a society. And then finally, the third theory: Tartaria was destroyed by an external force. There are many different accounts from both myth, legend, and fiction where we have some sort of dark, malevolent entity that comes from the outside, and that it wishes to impose its will on humanity. We see this reflected perhaps in the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's world, where we see the original Valar, one of the great deities, who had been corrupted and sought to corrupt the natural order of the world, and dedicated his entire existence to corrupting the world. It's very possible that our lands in the distant past could have been subjected to such an external force that sought to destroy the existing civilization. It is possible that that's what could have been inflicted on the previous civilization of Tartaria, that some sort of external force accessing the lands, whether it was through some sort of portal, some sort of interdimensional nexus where there was travel between dimensions or other lands. It sounds far-fetched, and yet at the same time we have so many different indications through many different perspectives that indicate that this is indeed possible. And it does give credibility to the fact that there could have been some sort of external force that attacked the previous civilization, targeting its cities and attempting to overcome it through an external existential battle, utilizing forces and means which we can't possibly understand, given the level of destruction that we see across the lands. Or perhaps it's some combination of these three theories. Perhaps all aspects play a significant part in what caused the fall of Tartaria. There was internal corruption that was inherent because the civilization had been around so long. There was an external force that attempted to attack it physically, but was defeated by the strength of the civilization. So the external force changed its approach. It changed its approach to corrupt the people from within. And we have to ask the question, does that corruption still exist to this day? Is it really the fact that human beings are born to be something inspiring, to achieve great things? Yet time and time again we see how they are corrupted by the purposes of others. And perhaps there's some malevolent entity that we can't fully understand. My theory comes from Neverwhere-land. There's a segment in the 1981 Canadian animated film called Heavy Metal, and this segment was called Neverwhere-land. It's a segment that did not appear in the final film. But just to summarize, this is one of the most disturbing segments you'll ever see. and I'll put the link in the description of the video. In Neverwhere Land, we see the malevolent entity called the Loknar, an entity that doesn't belong on the land that suddenly arrives. It influences and corrupts all the life forms in the land to destroy each other. And in a segment that only lasts 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and even though the animation isn't complete, you get a very dark, unsettling, and terrific feeling that overcomes you whenever you watch this segment. It's very difficult to watch, and I believe the reason that it is difficult to watch is because it accurately depicts what truly can happen to human beings time and time again when they become corrupted internally, when they suddenly find themselves willing to do horrific acts, all in the name of doing righteousness. And I will warn you, this is a very upsetting segment to watch, and it's very difficult. But it does accurately depict what can happen. And we certainly have so many examples within whatever history you happen to believe of events like this occurring. And that's probably why it's so upsetting and disturbing to watch, because we can't deny that what we're seeing in this 3-minute animated segment that wasn't even complete, that causes us to feel self-reflection, realizing what we could be truly capable of. We have the ability for greatness. But that's why it's so important that we ask questions and we understand ourselves. That's why I believe it is important that we're willing to explore ourselves and willing to face all the challenges of life, whatever the reality of existence is, with our own perspectives intact. Not unduly influenced by the forces of others, whether it's some malevolent entity or it's something that's simply trying to twist us to serve its own purposes. It's most important that we know who we are, and that's where I find we have the greatest hope for the future.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was.
And subscribe. Fire and wind come from the sky, and we're told that the Titan Prometheus provided humanity with the gift of fire, the gift of civilization. Yet fire is used in the fifth age of humanity, the Iron Age, as the ultimate implement to control, where might makes right. Today in this exploration, we examine the power of fire, the ultimate destroyer. We're going to consider how fire has been used for the last 150 years to control humanity. We begin by examining the Great Fire at Boston in November 1872. The downtown area of Boston had undergone rapid development, but the water mains had not been upgraded during these years. Roy is given an explanation for these incredible fires. And we examine the city fires that occurred in the 19th century, the vast city fires which seemed to destroy many wonderful buildings. We're also given an explanation from the historical account that the fire department was dealing with an epizootic, a disease affecting the equine animals, and they couldn't pull the heavy firefighting implements to fight this fire. Yet we look at the images of the destruction of Boston from the 1870s, and we see something that appears to be much more than the destructive effects of fire. Or if this was the destruction of fire, what kind of fire was this? Some sort of magical fire? There's always a scientific explanation for these fires. Yet this destruction, and where it ends and where it begins, doesn't seem to make sense, as we see there are some buildings that seem completely untouched by the fire, and yet other buildings that have been completely gutted and utterly destroyed. The fire spread rapidly, creating its own energy or firestorm, tremendous heat generated. Although many or most of the buildings were made of brick or stone, the window frames and other fixtures were made of wood, thus allowing the fire to communicate to nearby structures. And here we see it again in this image, where the fire seems to have destroyed some buildings and other buildings were left untouched. They even admit that many of the buildings were made of stone, as we see here. During the course of the fire, which burned uncontrolled for more than 12 hours, buildings were blown up using black gunpowder in a controversial effort to create a fire break. So here we have another account, that those that were fighting the fire were actually destroying the buildings themselves. How many of the buildings did they destroy trying to create the fire break? And how many buildings were destroyed by the fire itself? That's something you'll never find when you look at the historical account. When we see this vast rumbling and when we see these strange destructive effects of the fire on some of these buildings with these bizarre diagonal cuts. What's really going on here, and what's really the story behind this fire? We always have conflicting accounts when we look at these pictures. We'll see pictures like this which give us the indication of something that's smoke-charred ash remains. Is that really what happened? Or were these buildings destroyed to create a fire break? And we'll see this in many cities in the United States in the 19th century. And one of the reasons we focus on Boston is that it's one of the cities that's not covered as much. Despite the enormity of the fire, only 2 Boston firemen were killed, with the total deaths numbering between 13 to 20, depending on the source. So despite this being a very destructive conflagration, not many lives were lost at all, and that's not what we'd expect to see from such an account. The 1870s seemed to be a bizarre time when many fires struck cities in the north. We could look at destruction photographs in the south and explain it as being the effects of the Civil War. Yet, how far apart did these fires truly occur? We question the dates on the accounts in these photos. A lot of times they don't make a lot of sense. Yet we have no shortage of photos and depictions and artistic renderings of the destruction of the fire in Boston. We consider the fact that we're told that the fire was out of control and that they didn't have the means to fight it, and yet despite the fact that they didn't have the draft animals to pull the fire engines at the time, they still seem to have the capability to get around and set explosives to destroy many buildings, to create the so-called controversial fire breaks. Yet looking at this sort of destruction, looking at the rubbling, there seems to be a variety of explanations. We see that fire seems to have an explanation as some sort of destructive force, that due to the lack of responsibility of the civilization at that time, whether it was the local denizens of Boston, the city government, the state government, they caused this kind of strange fire with this bizarre destruction pattern to it. And yet at the same time, the official account also admits to us that many of the buildings were destroyed to create a fire break. We recall seeing the same account about San Francisco when the United States Army attempted to create a fire break because of the fire started by the earthquake in 1906. Yet examining this photo, we see the destruction patterns that seem to go far beyond a fire. The official account admits that these buildings were made out of stone and masonry. Yet they still burn such as this, even if the windowsills caught on fire. It's another in a series of anomalies, and there are many cities in the United States in the 19th century that were subjected to this kind of destructive force, and we always have a different story for the incipients of the fire. In St. Louis, we're told that a steamer ran out of control in the Mississippi River, crashed into other steamers and started a fire, and then somehow the city caught fire itself. It's very impressive, though, looking at the distant skyline of Boston, some of the structures that we see, the tall towers, the larger buildings, the intricate architecture. And now we go to the Peshtigo fire, a fire in Wisconsin that destroyed 17 communities across 1,875 square miles, reduced to smoldering ash, and killing as many as 2,500 people. 1871 as well, the same year, and also occurring on the exact same date as the Chicago fire, just to the south of this area of Wisconsin. We see an entire area of the northeastern portion of the state affected by the fire. And we look at the deaths. There are accounts that followed that bodies were untouched by the flame, but watches and change in the pockets had been melted. Nails were melted as well that were out of the path of the fire. There's something that seems to be beyond the normal abilities of fire when we consider the Peshtigo fire. And yet this event is forgotten by history, because this event occurred on the same time, the destruction of Chicago, another city fire which had relatively few deaths and destroyed a lot of buildings. And no doubt they employed the same tactics of fire break. There are few pictures from the Peshtigo fire, and yet we see the same kind of total destruction. Buildings reduced to rubble. We have accounts of people and animals seeking shelter in the water, even though the water was supposedly freezing at that time, although it was early October in Wisconsin and the weather can vary. Here we see the ruins of Peshtigo and a small group of fire survivors in 1871. What was truly going on here? This seems to be a wildfire that has many more accounts to it, with all the communities that were destroyed and the death toll. What exactly caused this fire? There are conflicting accounts. A priest wrote a number of these persons assert that there was a UFO that was spraying fire or causing destruction on houses in nearby buildings. This is an interesting account when we consider it because of the fact that while there are accounts of the fire starting through natural means or just due to logging, there are numerous people that saw some sort of UFO or flying object that seemed to target houses specifically and rain fire and destruction upon them. Is there any truth to this account? Well, it's hard to say, but it is interesting that the Peshtigo fire is very suppressed when you consider comparing it to Chicago. There's other areas, such as Hinckley, Minnesota, that were destroyed by fire in the same way. I had intended to do this exploration before the recent fire of Maui even transpired. The reality is that fire and its destructive forces have always been with us. It's not just something that we have in the account from 1870, but we also consider that in the 21st century, the report of California wildfires increased immensely and suddenly became national news. Now, it's safe to say that California wildfires occurred in the 20th century, but they certainly weren't reported on national news so much. And now it seems every summer it's basically a recurring event that you have. All these incredible wildfires that they have named, and then tracking the amount of acres that they're destroyed, and how much territory and property is destroyed, and how many lives are affected. Although the interesting thing about the wildfires is we don't tend to get the reports of the death toll that we'd expect. Why was the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin so devastating, but many of the wildfires in California, and the city fires that we just looked at, producing such a low count of death? It's very strange. Yet we consider the many photos that we have of destruction of communities in California, and we'll see something strange like this. This is supposed to be a wildfire, but we only see the structures themselves destroyed and the surrounding vegetation appearing untouched. What's truly going on here? Even the trees in the middle of the houses just appear to be singed. Many other explorers have looked at this and tried to ponder what the explanation is. Is this a fire? Is this some sort of implement of control? Or is this something else? Consider the fact that these structures have been completely reduced to essentially nothing. They're bare foundations. And in California, modern architecture techniques do not provide basement foundations. And some of these pictures or renderings that we have of wildfires strike the imagination, bringing fear of a force that is completely uncontrolled and something that we're often told is our responsibility due to the way that we live. Or oftentimes even just the way that we live, whether it's because of the fact that we use the technological implements that we're told to by the civilization that we live in, that it sets the conditions that causes these fires. And we're told this repeatedly. I enjoy this photo here. It's supposedly a satellite photo of one of the wildfires in California. I like how they even have the state boundaries depicted. I guess if you fly high enough, you'll see state boundaries. Regardless, it definitely paints the picture, though, that these wildfires are something that the powers that be want to remain in the public consciousness. And it's not just California that you'll see wildfires reported in, although that seems to be the area that they're reported in repeatedly. This is the image that we'll have of a wildfire, and we can see why this would strike fear in the hearts of any person who looks at this. A vast wall of flame that seems unstoppable. It requires the dry vegetation, and it's certain to say that the wind and dryness in California sets the perfect conditions for wildfire. I've lived in California. I've actually driven past many of these wildfires as they were burning. And you can understand with the wind and the dry vegetation that a simple act of irresponsibility could cause a conflagration such as this. However, we see that these fires have been with us for 150 years, and it's not just in California, it's in Canada in the summer where we've had reports of wildfires. Canada, a place that we traditionally don't associate with wildfires, and yet they seem to occur there as well. Are they just limited to Canada currently? Or are there other areas across the land where we have wildfires? I like this crystal ball fisheye view of the lands, and we're told that all the continents are subjected to and vulnerable to the concept of wildfire, whether it's Europe, Africa, Asia, for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes we'll be told that our lifestyle over the past decades or the past century have created conditions that cause wildfires to strike up in any random location. Even Indonesia and Australia, where we've had reports of wildfires. And we certainly don't want to forget the Amazon, where we've had reports of wildfires. So it seems that in our current setting that wildfires can occur any place, at any time. And they can threaten us. They can threaten our dwellings. They can threaten our livelihood. And there's really not a lot that we can do about it. It seems to be another one of those phenomena that we are just completely helpless to counter or to continue our way of life. And so why is it that our media reports this? And now consider all the state capitals in the United States, considering the facet of fire being a destructive force that is not just over a wide area, but is very specific. The original Texas state capitol in Austin, Texas, destroyed by fire in the 19th century. Yet, oddly enough, these fires were kept specific to these buildings, almost a surgical destructive force as opposed to a destructive force over a wide area. And then there was another fire in the subsequent Texas capitol, but this capitol survived in the 1980s, so official sources tell us. You ever consider how many state capitals are vulnerable to fire? And why is it we always have these fires that seem to strike our state capitals, the very heart of our local governments? Even the beautiful five-domed Iowa state capitol was subjected to a fire in the early 20th century. Fortunately, it survived. Apparently, the firefighting implements in Des Moines were ready to respond at the time to this capitol fire. It's also interesting when you see other pictures of the Iowa State Capitol that there's many other dwellings that supposedly surrounded it at the time, but they don't seem as visible in this picture. And there seem to be other questionable aspects about this picture. There was even a fire in the old Iowa Capitol in Iowa City in 2013 that destroyed the old gold dome. Well, why is it we have all these fires over all this time? Now we have modern fire engines. We're not reliant on animals to pull our old fire engines. And yet, for whatever reason, all these buildings still seem subjected to threat or vulnerability to fire. It's very strange when we consider this. And have you ever really sat back and thought about how many public buildings, how many beautiful buildings were destroyed by what I term a surgical fire? In other words, a fire that only affected one single building. And the original state capitol in Michigan, also destroyed by fire. Keep a running tally. Look at your own state and your own county. Look at how many public buildings were destroyed by one of these fires. Why is it these fires just seem to be so precise in what they destroy and with their timing? And look at what a beautiful edifice this was. We see some of the signs of the beautiful architecture with the earlier state capitol of Michigan. Why is it these fires continue to strike? What's really the purpose behind them? Are we to believe that this is just simply an act of recurring irresponsibility? People not being prepared for fire? Even Minnesota, its earlier state capitol, destroyed by fire, necessitating the newer state capitol, not too far from St. Paul's Cathedral in St. Paul, Minnesota. We see that this is a relatively beautiful building. It has a pediment, it has columns, it has a smaller dome. It seems a little bit more modest. And yet it was destroyed by fire as well. Why couldn't Minnesota have managed to save their state capitol from fire? Were they simply caught unprepared? Was it the nature of the fire? We have many different explanations for what caused these fires. Missouri, which actually had two state capitals burned by fire in Jefferson City. Very fascinating. The saying that lightning strikes twice in the same place. Well, believe it or not, they say that one of the state capitals was actually started on fire by a lightning strike. Very intriguing. And consider the odds behind it. How often do you hear of buildings being destroyed by fire started by a lightning strike? Not exactly something I recall hearing occurring a lot. It's possible, but it certainly seems random. Especially when we consider these other accounts that we have of how some of these fires started. And New York, the wonderful state of New York with its earlier capital being destroyed by fire as well. When you start to consider the probabilities and you look at all these state capitals that were destroyed by fire, individual surgical fires that seem to target these capitol buildings. Now, perhaps I'm going a little far by suggesting that these fires were not merely accidents or simple acts of negligence, but yet seeming to be intentional. North Dakota, its original state capital, destroyed by fire as well. You can find older depictions of the North Dakota state capital that seem to have a dome structure on it. It's very strange. It's also strange that when you consider the positioning of the state capital in North Dakota, in Bismarck, the capital city, it seems to be far away from the city. What exactly is going on there? We're also going to examine the subsequent state capitol that was built to replace this one in North Dakota, because it represents a strange amalgamation of building styles. Also, the old Washington state capitol, which caught fire as well. So strange, so many buildings across so many states, all catching fire. What do you think is the explanation for this? Is it simple negligence? Is it simply because of the fact that our elite governments, with all their responsibility and their charged responsibility to govern us, that they were unable to take the appropriate precautions to prevent fires in the state capitals? Oregon as well, if you ever wonder why Oregon has a very, how shall we say, unique state capital today. Consider what happened to its original state capital, which had the classic beautiful dome structure. Yet another victim of a destructive fire. And consider all the different explanations that were given for these fires. There was a rag that was left unattended to. There was somebody who was cleaning and they simply showed an act of irresponsibility. West Virginia too. After a while, when you start to look at all this, it gets to be a little absurd when you consider all these surgical fires that just happen to destroy all these state capitals. You're going beyond odds here, where it seems to be that the odds become one. One is in certainty that your state capital is going to be struck by a fire for some sort of strange reason. Always irresponsibility or negligence by the people within the state capital. And we have the historical accounts that tell us that. Let's not forget Wisconsin, where we're told that fire insurance was not purchased on the state capitol, and then that same day the state capitol just happened to burn down. A state capitol that's also located in the exact same place as the subsequent state capitol. No, there is nothing suspicious about any of these accounts. There is no reason to ask any questions. I'm sure that this is all just a fortuitous set of circumstances, that all these state capitals burned down all across the 19th through the early 20th century. Yes, the U.S. Capitol. It was a victim of fire as well in the 1930s, supposedly. Fortunately, the fire department in Arlington was on their A game, and they were able to put out the fire. But imagine if the U.S. Capitol had been destroyed by a fire in the 1930s. It seems to all be within that questionable time frame from the 19th century to the early 20th century. All these surgical fires and all these Capitol buildings. It was really at this point that I just decided to stop doing the research, because I had a feeling that if I looked at any state capitol, I was going to find an account of it burning. And then we consider the aspect of incendiary bombing or fire bombing in World War II. This was a tactic, an operational and even a strategic approach, an approach designed to win a war by using firebombing to destroy an enemy nation's means to wage war by targeting their essential infrastructure, their industrial capacity, or as the saying went at the time, bomb them into the Stone Age. Although the individual who made that saying said that he never said that. He said that we merely have the capability to bomb other nations into the Stone Age. World War II was considered one of the most definitive uses of firebombing. And cities such as Hamburg, Tokyo, the Axis nations' major industrial cities were subjected to firebombing, where vast incendiary bombs were dropped all day, all night on these cities, causing vast destruction, utilizing the concept of incendiary munitions, which caught many of the buildings on fire and started firestorms, or the wildfire that we see. And this is a targeted effort done by a nation's military to destroy another nation's means to conduct warfare. Here we see the remnants of Hamburg, Germany. Oftentimes, showing footage such as this creates trouble or causes controversy. Yet these are official photos, and this is the official historical account that Hamburg, Germany was destroyed in this means by using firebombing. Of course, it was fully justified, as the Axis nations were carrying out a campaign of evil, as we were told, and therefore they brought this sort of destruction upon themselves, and that's how it's justified. Yet these weren't the only nations that these sort of bombing campaigns were used on. And even here we see some of the old world architecture that does survive in Hamburg. It's amazing that anything survives such a firebombing campaign at all, and it's a testament to this architecture and its construction capability. But why is it some buildings that have the same construction capability were destroyed and others survived? Yet the firebombing was used in the Vietnam conflict, with many napalm strikes and even the same United States Army or United States Air Force commander, he started in the Army Air Force, suggesting that the concept of bombing a nation into a stone age would be a way to win the war. But how exactly did the Vietnam conflict end up for the United States? Certainly, the United States did not achieve its stated political goals in the Vietnam War by retaining South Vietnam. And here we look at the Hiroshima strike photo. Although we're told that later this is actually not the atomic mushroom cloud, but a pyrocumulus cloud over Hiroshima, a firestorm, the fires that were started by the atomic detonation. But this is not the mushroom cloud from the atomic detonation itself. This is the pyrocumulus cloud from the subsequent firestorm. It's interesting how much they look alike. However, it shows the destructive forces of fire. This is General Curtis LeMay, the primary proponent from the United States Air Force for the firebombing campaigns. And it's interesting that he was the one who suggested that air forces, the United States Air Force, be equipped to conduct a strategic bombing campaign. Well, he did actually fly a KC-135 Strato tanker, so you have to respect a general that actually got in the pilot's seat. However, it's interesting that what he set up for the United States Air Force, the official account says that it wasn't prepared to conduct the war in Vietnam, as it wasn't prepared to conduct a close air support role. Strangely enough, a propaganda photo that shows the Statue of Liberty burning, that liberty shall not perish from the earth, by Liberty Bonds. It stated that no Air Force in World War I, when this poster was produced, had the capability to conduct strategic bombing. Yet, oddly enough, we have an account of flying devices in Peshtigo in 1870 that seemed to do just that very thing. So what's really going on? Is there more reason to question the official account and the chronology that we're given of history when we see a poster like this? Well, this is simply to encourage people to support the war effort. And then finally, we consider how fire is questioned by modern individuals, such as Ben Tippett here, a PhD student who is studying, and his thesis researches the determinants of wealth concentration. Yes, of course, it's a class crisis. That's really what these wildfires are about. Some people have the resources to protect their houses in California because they have money and they can hire their own private firefighting forces, and others are simply subjected to the whims of the vast fires. But is that what's really going on? What's really going on with these fires? Or is Ben simply another unfortunate individual who's simply being used by the system? Incessantly in the news, these fires are. The world is on fire, and there's nothing we can do about it. It can happen any place at any time. Authorities will adapt to protect you. The conclusions about these fires is that fire destruction is at any scale, surgical or wide. It's always associated with the policy, how we live, or how we manage ourselves, and it's always present in any terrain at any time. It's always with us. Fire is fear, and it's noted in history repeatedly. It's present in war, peace, and everything between. It seems to be that the ambiguity of fire, whether it's our irresponsibility or whether it's an intentional destruction force. This video is dedicated to every life lost to fire. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Today we explore the Agonic Line terror, a merging of realities. But in order to understand the Agonic Line, we have to examine accounts of lost ships and planes. And we begin by examining the account of Flight 19, a squadron of 5 torpedo dive bombers that disappeared in 1945 after World War II. This flight of 5 Avengers was under the command of Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, United States Navy Reserve. It's a well-known and well-studied mystery which has had many different perspectives on examining the account of what really happened. It should be noted that in this particular plane, it was one crew member short, although there are conflicting accounts that say that there was a substitute crew member to fill in as the radio operator of this plane. I'd also like to highlight that the other planes had pilots that were of the same rank of the flight commander, Captain George Stivers, who was in the United States Marine Corps, and then in this other plane of Flight 19, under the command of Captain Edward Powers. Both of them shared the same rank and pay grade as Charles Taylor. This situation was quite famous because 14 airmen were missing, conducting a training flight after World War II. It should be noted that Charles Taylor was actually a veteran of World War II, and had served on the USS Hancock, a Essex-class carrier towards the end of World War II. This was considered quite an unprecedented disappearance, though, because Charles Taylor was a combat veteran and had managed to find his way around the Pacific Ocean. We all understand, if you're familiar with the story of Flight 19, that this involved navigational errors, and specifically, Charles Taylor was the individual who was initially blamed for the fact that the flight became disoriented and was unable to find its way back to its home base, or its original air station in Fort Lauderdale. Quite an intriguing account, though, when we look at the military record of Charles Taylor and the fact that he was someone who was actually elevated to the rank of flight instructor, and he had served as a naval aviator in the Pacific Ocean conflict. Our good friend, Skeptoid podcast host Brian Dunning, of course, condemns Charles Taylor and states that he's the one who made navigational errors. Brian Dunning bases his research on another researcher, an individual who we'll just call Lawrence because apparently I can't say his name, but I'll attach the link in the video description. And you can see that Lawrence did his own study 35 years after the fact. He even flew the route in completely different conditions and in a completely different plane. So therefore, I guess that's enough to say that he could officially debunk what happened to Flight 19. It's interesting to note, though, that they decide to condemn Charles Taylor as the individual who is responsible, and indeed, as the flight leader and commander, he is technically responsible for what happened. Although I find it fascinating that Charles Taylor did operate as a naval aviator in the Pacific conflict off the USS Hancock, an Essex-class carrier that saw a lot of action. Interestingly enough, it was the mother of Charles Taylor who decided to launch her own investigation after Flight 19 had vanished without a trace. Indeed, initially Taylor was found responsible when he reported that his compasses went out and that he was disoriented, believing he was over the Florida Keys, or south of Florida, and therefore tried to find his home station by flying on an azimuth that took him out in the middle of the ocean. That's what the official story said. To this day, though, there's never been any sign of wreckage of Flight 19 that's been found, and yet official sources tell us that the United States military had a very good idea and had actually triangulated the position of this flight shortly before it went down. Now, it should be noted that these torpedo dive bombers do sink rather fast when they ditch in the water, but it's rather strange when we consider the fact that this is right off the coast of Florida. There were several well-known radio triangulations that fixed the position of this flight, and that even though they were lost, the United States military had a very good idea of where they were, how much fuel they had left, and should have had a pretty good idea where they ditched. This diagram shows their originally plotted course on their training mission and a simple return to Florida, and it seems like it's simply a matter of 2 navigational turns to get back to Florida. Yet when this all transpired, the compasses went out, and for some reason Taylor was disoriented, and we don't really know what happened because we have transcripts of the radio transmissions. This apparently was the triangulation where they had located Flight 19, and they knew how much fuel they had left and had a pretty good idea of where they would have ditched. But as stated, no one's ever located any of the wreckage of these 5 planes when they ditched as they ran out of fuel. And it remains quite a mystery to this day in terms of what was really happening. Now you might be asking, what exactly does this have to do with the Agonic line? Well, the Agonic line, during this time frame, ran through this particular area. And indeed, it's been attributed to navigational issues, because on the Agonic line, you do not have to compensate for the grid to magnetic angle, which you do when you are not on this particular line. You have to compensate for grid to magnetic. It is worth noting, though, that if these planes did ditch, they wouldn't have stayed on the surface very long and would have sank rather quickly, as there have been many demonstrations that show it. Although there would have been time for the pilots to get out of the planes if they were stuck in the middle of the ocean and rescue efforts couldn't have located them, then it's certain to say that they would have perished. But there's also the note that this Martin PBM Mariner disappeared while searching for Flight 19. The official account states that it likely exploded in midair. Although when I was looking at accounts of this particular type of plane, there's only one other example of this plane exploding in midair. No other examples. It's also worth noting that that same type of plane was the one that crashed in Operation High Jump under the command of Admiral Byrd. So what really happened to Flight 19? Well, officially, the flight was lost, and it should be noted that Charles Taylor was cleared by the United States Navy of any wrongdoing because his compasses malfunctioned. But why didn't either of the Marine officers take command if Charles Taylor was incompetent, or compromised, or lost? One would expect that would be the case. To this day, we don't know the fate. All we know is that we have individuals such as Brian Dunning, skeptoids who have confirmation biases, who simply want to state that they know exactly what happened, and other researchers. But that's one event. Let's move on to the same area with the loss of the USS Cyclops towards the end of World War I in 1918. This was a collier, or a ship that was designed to haul around coal, which was something they did in World War I in 1918. And this was another large news story of a ship, as opposed to planes that just randomly disappeared. And no, our friend Brian Dunning did not cover this particular disappearance, perhaps because it did not conform to some of his confirmation biases, or maybe he just didn't get around to it. In any event, in March 1918, while returning from a voyage to Brazil, the Cyclops and her crew disappeared. An entire crew of 300 sailors. Now, there was a war going on at that time, World War I, and there were German U-boats that were operating throughout the entire Atlantic. Yet it should also be noted that this ship was never confirmed lost or seized or destroyed by the Germans when German records were examined towards the end of World War I. So again, it's another disappearance. The commander of the ship, Commander Worley, actually was born in Germany with a German name, but he had been in the United States most of his life. Oddly enough, he had some strange psychological aberrations, so once again we have another account of a commanding officer who seems to have been compromised in some way. Yet, oddly enough, none of the other crew would have done something if their commanding officer was acting strange. Military discipline just always wears out. Nobody ever pulls a Commander Riker and relieves Captain Picard when he's about to take the ship into the sun. I mean, I know it's quite an analogy, but we have several examples of this happening. Worley was stated to have psychological aberrations, walking around in his underwear and a bowler hat at night, and often being a strict disciplinarian with his crew, going beyond the means of even normal naval discipline. But beyond all that, what exactly happened to the USS Cyclops? One might think that perhaps there was some sort of German conspiracy to actually seize the ship, but again, there's nothing in the German records. And indeed, at the end of World War I, the entire German high seas fleet was turned over to the Allies. So it seems rather strange. And even to this day, the Cyclops remains a mystery of sea. Now, there's theories that it was lost in a storm, that there was some issue with something that they loaded on the ship and it caused possibly an explosion. But again, not a single trace of the ship has been located, or the crew. No mutiny, no signs of anything else happening, nothing ever located on the bottom of the ocean. So, a strange series of conflicting accounts. And looking at the individual of Worley, who, oddly enough, there are accounts that his psychological aberrations seemed to get worse right before the ship disappeared. So again, it's another mystery, much like Flight 19. But also like Flight 19, this also occurs in a geographical area that does run along the Agonic line. Again, this could simply be a coincidence. But what do you really think? Can we really add any text to this particular story? Or is it really just as it is, another ship that just happened to randomly disappear? Now, the main reason that we're exploring these accounts of disappearances is that you might think that these are isolated incidences. And indeed, if they were, then perhaps we could simply dismiss them as misfortune, or it really was due to the commanding officers in both cases being compromised. Although again, we have to state that the whole reason that the rest of the crew, or the rest of the entire member of the military unit, did not decide to revolt or mutiny or impose order. It's just all very strange. It's very strange to think of the fact that an entire ship disappeared with a crew of 300, and this was towards the end of World War I. And there's nothing in the German records that indicate that this was due to enemy action of any way, shape, or form. And we look at this particular area, and we'll see later that this is the exact geographical area where in the past the Agonic line ran through. So what exactly happened to the Cyclops? All we really have is speculation. And of course, someone such as a Skeptoid podcast host will tell us that we shouldn't make any sort of skeptical, or we shouldn't make any sort of inquiries. And I always find it fascinating that a skeptic simply means that someone has difficulty believing something. So they come in to do research with a confirmation bias because they're trying to disprove something, rather than simply looking at the facts objectively. Indeed, Mr. Brian Dunning claims that Charles Taylor's bad luck and his poor pilot and navigation skills caught up to him. Perhaps much in the same way that Brian Dunning's poor luck caught up to him when he was trying to run a cookie stuffing scheme against eBay. But I'll put those links in the description and you can come to your own conclusions about him. It's quite a tragedy, though, to think of an entire ship and entire planes just disappearing without any trace. Was there something off with Worley? Did he actually give a command to the ship that put it in a dangerous situation and caused it to sink? And we still wonder exactly what happened to it? Was this somebody who was affected by other forces? And indeed, to go back to the statement of Flight 19, there were other planes that had difficulty with navigation. And now we go to the Great Lakes, in Lake Superior, where an ore vessel was lost, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. And this was not World War I or after World War II. This was late 1975 when this transpired. So we're talking about more modern equipment, more modern technology, and even more strange, in Lake Superior, a freshwater lake that's surrounded by land, certainly not the open ocean. And yet you might be surprised to know that Lake Superior, and especially the area where the ship was lost off of Whitefish Point, is a well-known area where many ships have been lost. It's considered a graveyard of Great Lakes shipping. But how exactly could something like this transpire? This area in Whitefish Point is very close to land, and one would not expect that Lake Superior would be that difficult of an area to navigate. And yet there are many different examples of ships, such as the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, that came across difficult conditions and suddenly sank. Now you're probably asking, well, wait a minute, again, what does this have to do with the Agonic Line? Because I thought the Agonic Line was east of Florida. Well, actually, would you be surprised to know that the Agonic Line has moved over time? And the Agonic Line was in this particular area of the United States in the Great Lakes. There's always interesting shipping that was always used, and these were purpose-built ships to get across the Great Lakes. And yet there were so many losses because of the unique conditions on Lake Superior. So many ships that went to the bottom near Whitefish Point and in other areas, and not just Lake Superior, but also Lake Michigan. It's rather strange. There's also accounts of planes that have vanished without a trace, and this seems really strange because wherever you're flying at particular altitudes, you can see the land off either wing. We also examined the account of what happened to the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, and it should be noted that unlike the other two examples, we do know where the wreckage is, at the bottom of Lake Superior, and we have a relatively good idea of what happened. It seems to be extreme weather tore the ship apart and it abruptly sank. It was traveling in tandem or close to another ship during these difficult stormy conditions on the Great Lakes. There's also the legend of the Three Sisters, or the three waves that suddenly come up, rogue waves that rapidly smash into ships that are traversing the Great Lakes, especially this area in Lake Superior, and brings them under very difficult and overwhelms their structural capacity. There's also the reputation of the captain of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, who was considered a hard-driving skipper, or someone who would take his ship through very difficult weather conditions instead of going off to wait them out in a safe bay. So a very interesting series of accounts. But once again, we have to recall that this was not an isolated incident, especially with this series of shipping accidents that occurred on Lake Superior. And we can find in other images that it does seem that during particular times of the year, navigation and traversing the Great Lakes might be a matter of a little bit more difficulty than one would initially think. Indeed, the graveyard of the Great Lakes accompanies the myth of the Three Sisters, and it should also be noted that there's a lot of Native American myths about particular creatures and strange weather phenomena that may be operating in and around the Great Lakes. Is there something from these forces that still persist to this day? Or is this just simply a matter of this being a unique area where there are unique weather phenomena that caused all of these ships that you see pictured here to sink?
and the particular time and date that they sank within the Great Lakes. It gives the impression that even the purpose-built ships had struggles and faced many great losses. And we're not talking about the open ocean here, we're again talking about the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada, an enclosed space where one would think that navigation would be easy. And indeed, when you look closer at all the shipping that's been lost in Lake Superior alone, it does give the impression that this is a much more challenging area to operate in than one would originally believe. But what does this all state about this Agonic line that we're looking at? Is this because there are some sort of unique conditions? And we stated earlier that trying to understand what conditions these ships, these planes faced during this particular time is not necessarily something that we could replicate even if we traverse the same area at a later point in time. It seems as though the conditions change based on some factors that we're not necessarily familiar with. Because many other days you could sail quite easily across the Great Lakes. You won't encounter bad weather. It'll be quite an easy place and an easy journey to undertake. But I would certainly not recommend that you go swimming in Lake Superior in August, especially if you're someone from Florida. But the Great Lakes are an anomaly in and of themselves. How exactly were they formed? Why are they so specific in their geographical location? And even more strangely, why is it we have older maps that don't show the Great Lakes? Perhaps the cartographers simply weren't aware of them, but oddly enough, when we're informed that exploration was based on following waterways, we would expect that the Great Lakes would be one of the first things that the explorers would be aware of. Regardless, we do have other diagrams that give us an idea of how these Great Lakes freighters could break apart and some of the phenomenon that would be responsible. Now, of course, this would be natural phenomenon, and the layout of Lake Superior seems like it would support the destruction of these ships. But again, it's a large scale of losses, and oftentimes there are other ships and other planes that have disappeared without a trace. And so what exactly is really going on with this particular area? We also look at some of the very unique original purpose-built ships, the whalebacks that operated on the Great Lakes. Quite an intriguing design, and yet there's no shortage of this purpose-built design also having struggles. And so we look at this in totality, ships and planes in particular areas that just disappeared. What exactly is the Agonic line? Well, when we look at the concept of navigation, we start by examining the pole. And with navigation, we have three poles. We have the North Magnetic Pole, we have the actual geographic North Pole, and then we have the North Geomagnetic Pole. Yes, 3 poles for navigation. What exactly is the commonality? Well, there's 3 types of direction. You have true north, a line from any point on the Earth's surface to the North Pole. You have magnetic north, the direction to North Magnetic Pole, indicated by a north-seeking needle of a magnetic compass. And then you have grid north, vertical grid lines on a map, utilized by the United States military and other militaries for rescue teams and the accuracy. When you are not on the Agonic line, you have to convert your grid north to your magnetic north. And on every military flat map, yes, they have flat maps in the military, they tell you exactly how to convert a magnetic to a grid azimuth. So you can make sure that when you've plotted a course or an azimuth, and you're using a compass to follow it, you're actually following the compass. Now what's strange about the Agonic line is you don't have to make this adjustment. You don't have to adjust for grid to magnetic north, because you're on the Agonic line. So when you plot your course on your grid map, you just simply shoot your compass. And yet other individuals have stated that because navigators, whether they were naval aviators or pilots of ships, they didn't actually have to make this adjustment. And yet they did, and this is why they had vast navigational errors. This is one of the official explanations for why these particular areas that we've looked at, and yes, they have other names to them with geographical names, but individuals like Brian Dunning claim to have debunked them, or rather they've referenced the researchers of others, such as Brian referencing the research of the individual named Lawrence, who investigated Flight 19 35 years after the fact, and after the family of Charles Taylor had passed away, and claimed to have come to a conclusion. But back to understanding the Agonic line, you might be surprised to know that there's a lot of drift in what magnetic north actually is. So the point that we actually have with magnetic north changes over time, and therefore where your needle on your magnetic compass is pointing changes. Apparently this has been well known, and this is documented on earlier maps used for navigation.
Of course, these were earlier maps that, again, didn't show the Great Lakes in North America and depicted Antarctica as a vast landmass called Terra Australis. Quite intriguing, but they seem to be aware of this phenomenon, this variance. There's also the fact as to where the Agonic line currently runs. And remember that it was originally further east, and we'll take a look at some historical examples of where the Agonic line was. Remember that the Agonic line is where you do not have to adjust from grid to magnetic north and vice versa. Yet, if you look at other examples of these lines and these Agonic lines and where they run and where they've operated, you can see that there's vast differences for what sort of adjustment you need to make. So if you're a mariner and you're sailing the oceans of the lands, you need to make sure that you make this proper adjustment if you're relying on a magnetic compass. Very strange that the Agonic line also happens to run right over the area of Dubuque, a city which is near the border of, which is in Iowa on the Mississippi, near the boundary of Wisconsin and Illinois. That's come up in our explorations quite a lot. What exactly is the significance of the Agonic line? And why does it always seem to be running in areas where there's strange events that occur, or many disappearances, or natural disasters? Whatever the real reason for the disappearance or losses of these ships, we can see that at some point in the time in the past, the Agonic line has run through these particular areas, whether it was in Lake Superior or in the Atlantic off of Florida. It's rather strange, too, that we have other maps that show the Agonic line being further east. And again, that drift is attributed to the change in the magnetic field of the planet. At least, that's what the mainstream will inform us, although who knows exactly how they came to these conclusions. One of the interesting things to me here is now in this older map we have the Agonic line running directly over Chicago and Peshtigo, Wisconsin, two areas that we've explored. And here in this older map we can see where the Agonic line was plotted in the past, in 1803, 1850, 1875, and 1890. And here's where you can see that the Agonic line did exist in the geographical areas where these other strange disappearances occurred. And of course, like I said, there is that name for the, how shall we say, pseudoscience geographical area of Florida, off of Florida, but we're not going to mention that name because we're focused on the Agonic line today. It's very interesting to me that other explorers very rarely look into the concept of the Agonic line. And yet the fact is that we're reliant on Earth's magnetism to ascertain exactly where the line is going to be. And it also plays a role in how we have to adjust our map to compass readings based on where we're positioned. Yet, oddly enough, how exactly do we know about this south magnetic pole, this north magnetic pole, and the generation of this magnetic field? It seems to be something that we've studied, and yet we don't fully understand. It's something that we claim to understand. But what's really going on with these magnetic poles? Is there some other force that's being generated here? Is there some other explanation for what's truly happening? Because why do we really have this drift in magnetic pole? The explanation will be it's because our magnetic field changes. And you might recall that the only film that ever decided to try to explore the concept, a rather forgotten film from 2003 called The Core, which involves a group of explorers going to the very core of the Earth to restart it, because scientific meddling prior had caused the core to stop generating the magnetic field, and soon the Earth was going to be burned by the sun. And naturally, the solution was to involve building a burrowing ship made of a material called unobtainium, yes, that term gets used a lot, to go to the center of the Earth. And they had to restart the core. And you never guess how they'd have to do it, by detonating a couple nuclear weapons. Ah, yes. How many times is the plot of a film solved by detonating a couple nuclear weapons? Especially during this time frame. Well, the film had some interesting premises behind it, although it is considered fantasy because no one's really ever gotten that far into the Earth's crust, and even the deepest borehole doesn't even come close to actually reaching through the crust. These are the voyages of Captain Greenwood and First Officer Swank as they explore beneath the surfaces. But the odd thing about this film, though, is we really have to consider what understanding do we have of the magnetic field? Because this is really more of a fantasy film. They wouldn't consider this science fiction. And why is it that this variance in the Earth's magnetic field causes the Agonic line to shift? And what's really happening along the Agonic line? Is this a natural phenomenon?
Or is this some sort of remnant of a previous civilization? Is this some sort of technology that they had attempted to apply, and this is what caused all these changes? This is why we have these variances in where the Agonic line is, depending on time. And therefore, if the Agonic line is moving, which we're informed that it is, because magnetic north changes as time passes, then how could anyone have replicated the conditions when they try to determine what happened to these lost planes and these lost ships? Indeed, imagine if this was some sort of remaining technology. What was it really all about? Did the previous civilization rely not only on cymatics, not only on frequency, but also on some sort of force and understanding of magnetism? What if what we think of as the planet's magnetic field is actually generated by remaining technology that's still from the previous civilization that we do not completely understand? And if that is the case, then what remnants of this technology are to be found out on the land? Has someone already located them, and do they have an understanding of what this technology is? I find it awfully strange that the United States military, during a time after World War II, decided to clear Charles Taylor, absolve him of all wrongdoing, even though they had the very clear individual who was responsible for Flight 19 being lost. And yet, at the behest of his family, they just decided to say he wasn't responsible. It almost seemed as though the family was asking questions that somebody didn't want it asked, and they decided to basically say, well, he wasn't really responsible, his compasses failed, and that's why the flight was lost. Now don't ask any more questions about it. And then about 3 decades later, our special researcher Lawrence decided to debunk it. And then it was reinforced by our good friend Brian Dunning. But what are your thoughts? Is the Agonic line some sort of blending of realities? Is it some sort of remaining technology? Or is it all just a massive coincidence? Is it all just the fact that these ships and these planes disappear in these areas because disaster strikes and it just happens to strike in the same place? Does luck actually play a factor? I'm surprised Brian Dunning doesn't ask for that. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me.
The serenity and the beauty of the Great Lakes hides many secrets. And as you look over this very interesting rock face at the wonder of Lake Superior going off into the horizon, you could be understood to realize that there doesn't appear to be any sort of mystery here. It's a beautiful natural area. And yet the Great Lakes behind its veneer of beauty hides many mysteries. There are many strange occurrences, such as odd architecture with the Perry Victory and International Peace Monument. There's also the fact that the Great Lakes don't appear on many early maps. Perhaps the cartographers were simply not aware of them. We have many shipping losses that have occurred in the Great Lakes throughout the years. Strange weather phenomenon. And one wouldn't expect that to be the case. Yet there's not a single graveyard in the Great Lakes. Every single one of the Great Lakes is a massive shipping graveyard. So what's exactly the situation here? Do we have strange weather patterns? Is it simply a place where perfect storms occur? We also have the presence of these very intriguing cities, such as Chicago or Shilaga on Lake Michigan. And least we forget Cleveland, another city that we've explored off Lake Erie. Many great cities and many strange phenomenon, along with Milwaukee. Why is it we have these mysteries on the Great Lakes? And why is this such an overlooked area? Join me as we explore these mysteries and try to unravel this vortex in the terrifying Great Lakes. The first question is the map anomaly. Why are the Great Lakes not actually on the maps that we have? When you look at the Great Lakes, if you're not familiar with the area, it's well known for being a very peaceful and serene area, especially the landscape around it. This is also stated to be the largest freshwater ecosystem in the land, and it's in the middle of North America. Although it should be noted that there are larger sources of fresh water in South America and in Asia from Russia at this day. But the Great Lakes has a special mystery and beauty behind it that many overlook because it does seem like it's a peaceful area. And the first anomaly being the maps. Ah yes, this lovely map where we have California depicted as an island. We do actually have a large body of water here in these rather strange mountains that look to be where Wisconsin and Iowa are today, running east to west. But perhaps the cartographers simply didn't know about the presence of the lakes. It is rather strange, though, since we understand the first explorations of North America to occur were done on boats, going down the waterways and looking for different points of interest. And it's rather odd that such large lakes, which the Great Lakes are indeed very large, would be missed by the early cartographers. But again, it was early exploration, and perhaps it just simply took them a little period of time to understand the land. That may not be as mysterious as it seems. But again, it's another oddity because we do have these early maps that were made by cartographers who needed to know exactly how to depict the various sea routes and the understanding of the land for proper navigation. And even on these later maps where we see we don't have the dramatic depiction of California as an island, we still don't have any Great Lakes. We do have Shilaga present, at least where we would expect Chicago to be, although some argue it's Montreal, and maybe it is. Who knows for sure? That's the whole point, though. It's rather odd that these maps would be so precise and yet omit a major detail as the Great Lakes. And we have Florida depicted in wonderful detail here, and we have these other strange cities or castles or whatever this is really supposed to claim, and other odd settlements that seem to be properly labeled. Now really go back in time and think about this as they were making these maps. How could there really be so many misconceptions yet with exact coordinates, which you can really take from the lines of latitude and longitude on these early maps? It's always mystified me with the fact that we don't have the Great Lakes shown on so many of them. And indeed, it's not until you reach the maps of the 1700s and the 1800s when you start to see even the early depictions of the Great Lakes. Although another oddity is that even some of the later maps omit them when we'd expect them to be there. I mean, really think on this. This is the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world, and yet it was omitted from these maps of exploration. We had these great Spanish and French explorers that were trumping all over the land of North America, and yet somehow they missed the Great Lakes, but they did manage to properly catalog certain mountain ranges, or mountain ranges that weren't there anymore. Again, it's just that odd fact with maps that we don't always know exactly what we're looking at, and we have so many variations. Norumbega. What exactly is Norumbega? So many different questions and so many considerations. And yet as time passed, you can see that eventually the Great Lakes did find their way onto the early maps. But it's rather strange that it seemed to be the St. Lawrence Seaway which was gradually widened, and then all of a sudden the lakes appeared in the later maps. Now, really consider that question. Was there actually a time when the Great Lakes were not present? Well, official history tells us that the Great Lakes were formed very recently, but certainly not within the last couple hundreds of years. And then we also see other variations of maps with California still depicted as an island or a separate landmass, but we do have some larger bodies of water. But again, you can see here that it seems to be incomplete and uncertain. So perhaps the explorers, the cartographers, they just simply didn't understand exactly where everything was. But again, the fact that this persisted for such a long period of time, when we had accurate navigation methods, it does seem to be the first prevalent mystery behind the Great Lakes. That real question of, were they always there? Were they always there even in more recent times than we'd like to believe? Because if these maps were accurate, and if they were properly surveyed, then we should see the Great Lakes on them, but we see absolutely nothing showing any sort of lake. And why is that the situation? Now, of course, as along with everything else, it seems as though the first proper maps that fully cataloged and surveyed the Great Lakes came from the 1800s or the late 1700s, depending on if you accept the original publication and composition time for these maps. And we finally start to get the sign that there are Great Lakes there, even with the proper names. It's such an anomaly because of the fact that if you think about how large these Great Lakes are, how could they have ever been missed? But of course, once the 1800s came along, the entire United States came into being, and it seems as though the Great Lakes came into being. Now, I'm speaking with dramatic flair in this particular situation, but it is very strange to me. And I think it's one of the most compelling mysteries that there was a time on many maps that there were no Great Lakes displayed at all. And again, it's only on the more recent maps. It is rather strange that we have so many events that allude to the 1800s. Officially, the Great Lakes were formed by the passage of glaciers, and we'll take a brief look at that from our scientific interpretations of it, and look at our official mainstream explanation for why the Great Lakes exist. I remember my first understanding of the Great Lake Superior having enough water in it to flood all of North and South America a foot deep. I don't know if that fact is true, but that's something that was relayed to me in one of my early classes. And here you can see the whole concept of how glaciers are stated to have passed over this landscape. And very recently, within the last 10 to 12,000 years, again, we always have these precise dates from the past, these glaciers passed over the landscape, left dead ice behind, and this is what is responsible for the very exact and precise formation of the Great Lakes, the glacial formation of the Great Lakes. I've always found it intriguing, though, that this did not happen in other portions of the land. This only happened very specifically in North America. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is impossible, merely pointing out the fact that this is a unique occurrence. All of these incredible lakes formed by this glacier all in this exact same period. And here we have the statement 12,500 years before present. Now, there's even claims that there were natives and inhabitants that witnessed this all happen right in front of their eyes. Although granted, it was on a very long timeline. Although with our normal chronology, we tend to see that natural formations such as this don't take place over a couple hundred or even a couple thousand years. It's usually something that takes place over millions of years. And so right here we already have a strange anomaly in addition to the map concept with the Great Lakes. They aren't on the earlier maps, and it seems as though even the scientific explanation says that they formed very recently. And when you go to the landscape and the area around the Great Lakes, you will find that there are many intriguing anomalies that even go past their legend of natural formation. And yes, I say legend of natural formation because there are claims there were inhabitants that actually witnessed this happen. But there's lots of remnants of very intriguing architecture and infrastructure that exist across the Great Lakes. Again, we could say it's easily explainable because there's many natural resources that flow out of the Great Lakes. There's also an incredible amount of shipwrecks all over. And there's many different explanations to explain the situation for why what we would expect to be peaceful inland lakes, even if they are large, have so many vicious weather situations within them. And why are all the Great Lakes known to be ship graveyards? It's another one of those puzzling mysteries that seems to be overlooked. Here you have it, the maps of the graveyard of the Great Lakes. In Lake Superior, all of these ships that have sunk or disappeared over time. Now, the prevailing explanation is that there is a unique weather condition that exists within the Great Lakes. And one of these weather conditions is called the Three Sisters in Lake Superior, a series of 3 rogue waves brought about by extreme weather conditions. Again, not exactly something that we'd be expecting. And perhaps one of the most famous shipwrecks on Lake Superior being the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which occurred very recently in the 1970s. And when you look at Lake Michigan, you'll see that it's no different. A vast array of shipwrecks and shipping losses over the years. I'm also impressed by the fact that we have a very precise and exact record, going all the way back to the 1600s, of every single large ship that was lost over time in these Great Lakes. Again, I'm not suggesting that it's impossible. It's just intriguing that we have these documents and these records so well kept. Because oftentimes when we have shipping losses, they tend to be obfuscated with legend and myth. Many times we'll have people that are skeptics or investigators who will tell us that shipping losses are merely the subject of myth and legend and that they didn't really happen. Or if we did in fact have all these major wrecks in 1600 here in Lake Huron, that they are very well documented and well known, and we know that every single one of these ships were lost due to unfortunate circumstances. But there's no mystery. There's never any mystery. Although when we look deeper into the legends and the myths behind the Great Lakes, we start to see that there are many more mysteries. We looked at their formation and the lack of the fact that they're on early maps. And now we have this strange weather phenomenon that occurs, not just in Lake Superior, but in all of the Great Lakes, with all of these shipping losses, and every single one of the Great Lakes being a true ship graveyard. Not exactly what we'd expect. And if you talk to mariners, they will tell you that, for the most part, sailing on the Great Lakes is rather easy, that there is no real weather difficulty to be expected. But then, contrary to their initial expectations, once bad weather comes up, it becomes some of the most difficult conditions many of them have seen. Now, what are really the differences between sailing on a freshwater lake and sailing in the open ocean? What are the different challenges? Many people will tell you, even beyond mariners, that they wouldn't expect the Great Lakes to be a difficult place to sail. We all understand that it makes sense for logistics to go outside the Great Lakes, and there's many products that are produced and shipped out on the St. Lawrence Seaway to the open ocean. The loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, as recently as 1975, and Gordon Lightfoot, of course, did the song on it. And there's mystery behind this, because the Edmund Fitzgerald was very well documented, quote unquote, and it was very well tracked as it went off on its path, and yet suddenly encountered very bad weather. Of course, this is one of the many hundreds of ships that we see that have been lost over time. Is there some sort of strange phenomenon that occurs on the Great Lakes? Some bizarre weather pattern that occurs that may be the result of some other forces even beyond weather? There's no doubt that there are rogue weather patterns that occur all over the land at strange times, but there do seem to be certain areas where these strange weather patterns occur with some sort of habitual recurrence. And why is this? Why is it that this legend of the three sisters, which apparently doesn't seem to be as much of a legend as we might think, exist on the Great Lakes? How is it that there are these weather phenomenon that can cause these very extensive shipping losses in these, what are supposed to be, easy to traverse inland seas? And these are freshwater seas. Granted that they're large enough and filled with a lot of water to be somewhat intimidating, because I still remember that factor, whether it's true or not, that there's enough water in Lake Superior to flood all of North and South America a foot deep. Who knows? Maybe there's a lot more water in it than we can imagine. But there are documentations and official accounts of horrific weather patterns that have affected shipping over the years on the Great Lakes, to say nothing for sailing there during the winter, because we are operating here at more northern latitudes. And I think that's one of the things that's always drawn me to the mystery of the Great Lakes that tends to be overlooked, because there are a lot of shipping losses. And by the way, there's not just shipping losses, there's also been numerous aviation incidences around the Great Lakes. And indeed, the area was featured in an In Search Of episode, The Mystery of the Great Lakes. And oddly enough, people tend to overlook it because they see the serenity and beauty of the Great Lakes, and also the fact that it is a major area for population. There are many cities on the Great Lakes, and they don't think of it as an area of mystery. But is it possible that there's something much more insidious going on here? That there could be some strange implications of bizarre electromagnetic phenomenon that are occurring on the Great Lakes. There's even the presence of the original Agonic line that flowed through the middle of the Great Lakes. Now, you may recall the Agonic line that we've explored in the past. It's constantly shifting over time, which is very odd in and of itself, because the existence of this line might be a reference to the changing of magnetic forces over time. And again, it could be another reference to strange phenomenon that are occurring that we can't easily explain. And whether we're in the Great Lakes or in that little area of the Caribbean that we've talked about and explored in the past, could there be a connection? Could it even be possible that we're looking at some old effects from some technology of a previous civilization? Again, these will be dismissed by skeptics as simply being the wild imagination of people looking for explanations when there are none. That it's simply the reality of the Great Lakes that were very recently formed, weren't depicted on early maps, and seem to have been very recently discovered, that they just have these strange weather patterns that exist upon them. That it can be hazardous to sail a ship at any point in time through these strange weather patterns. Again, even though you're on an inland sea of fresh water, and you would expect the fact that you are completely surrounded by land to mitigate any weather patterns. And there's the aviation losses that have occurred over time. Many strange documented situations where entire planes have crashed or disappeared. And this is certainly not what we'd expect, because at the altitude that you fly, you're typically always going to see the land from any direction that you look. This isn't flying a plane over the ocean where it's ocean all the way out to the horizon. You're out in inland sea. You're in the middle of North America. Why would this be a difficult area where we have aviation losses? And yet again, we have numerous aviation losses. Very well documented aviation losses within our friends the media, talking about an airplane carrying 58 missing over Lake Michigan. And again, how large is Lake Michigan, especially from the air? Perhaps we could understand some ships being lost due to weather phenomenon, but what about these strange aviation losses that tend not to make a lot of sense? Why is it we have airplanes that have disappeared frequently over the Great Lakes? And we even have this memorial to Northwest Flight 2501, disappeared or went down June 23rd, 1950. Now, all these people who lost their lives, perhaps it is just an isolated aviation incident. And certainly accidents do occur, but why are there so many of them? And why is it the fact that this phenomenon seems to be confined to the Great Lakes and the area around the Great Lakes? There comes a point in time when you have a situation that recurs so many times that you have to start paying attention to it. There are rumors, legends, and myths of a triangle of doom or a zone of doom that exists over Lake Michigan, where there's been an extreme series of losses of both ships and planes over time. Now, you can certainly look at the records yourself and attempt to ascertain if there is something to this theory. Anytime we have an area of land or water that's designated, and typically whenever there's a triangle, well, then that's where we tend to have the issue of understanding why these phenomenon exist. Because oftentimes skeptics will say, this doesn't exist, it's merely the product of imagination, or I'm going to sit out and I'm going to debunk this. Just because there's a lot of ships and a lot of planes that went down in this particular area doesn't necessarily mean there's anything strange going on. But this goes beyond just shipping and plane losses over time. We also have unexplained phenomenon, numerous UFOs, very strange weather patterns that have been seen in and around the Great Lakes over time. Now, what exactly are UFOs? Unidentified flying objects, or unidentified aerial phenomenon, as we seem to have renamed them here in the 2000s? But whatever you want to say, it's hard to ignore the fact that there are so many accounts of these strange events all centered around this area. Again, perhaps it is just an incredible coincidence. Maybe there's something within this fresh water that simply causes us to believe that there's weird events and we simply can't come up with an explanation. On the topic of strange events, let's explore the really unique architecture of the Perry Victory and International Peace Monument. This is to commemorate the victory of Oliver Hazard Perry, a U.S. naval hero during the very interesting War of 1812, when he managed to build a fleet on Lake Erie and defeated the British fleet, which was also built on the other side of Lake Erie, in a decisive naval conflict in 1812. This monument was constructed, according to official sources, from 1912 to 1915. It happens to be the largest Doric column in the world. Of course it's the largest Doric column in the world. What else would it be? And constructed right before World War I, at least the United States entry into World War I. How fascinating. This was apparently a very decisive victory, this Battle of Lake Erie that Oliver Hazard Perry led. And for whatever reason, it stopped the attempted British control of the Great Lakes. I find it rather fascinating, though, that it wasn't really that decisive, because at the time the British had the greatest navy in the world, and they did actually land an expeditionary force that burned Washington, D.C. to the ground. But for whatever reason, securing the Great Lakes was decisive, winning the War of 1812. Also rather strange that the War of 1812 was named after a year and not something else. You know, the War of Preventing Sailor Impressment or something. I guess it just doesn't sound as cool. I mean, why hasn't there ever been another war that's been named after a year? Beyond that, we do have early construction photos of this impressive Doric column. And of course, we see the exact same construction techniques that we've seen in all the other construction photos that we have of virtually all the structures that were built from, 1860 to 1930, it seems like. Now, maybe it's possible. Maybe we did really build this structure. And maybe we had individuals such as this, people who worked 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, and only had Sundays off when they would spend the entire day in church, who constructed these very, very impressive blocks that completed the Perry International Peace and Victory Monument. Yes, I'm mixing it up there. It's just intriguing to me that this monument is to commemorate Perry's victory over the British, but then it's also to celebrate the peace that's existed between the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. I guess that was still a big thing in the early 1900s, prior to the special relationship that was enjoyed by the United States and the United Kingdom, and of course the subsequent signing of the Atlantic Charter. Seriously, look into the Atlantic Charter, it's quite intriguing. But on the interior of this very impressive monument, once again we see interesting symbols, and we see construction techniques and detailing that we certainly don't see the construction photos really convincing us that this was all done. Now again, I'm not saying that we didn't actually have the evidence that our civilization built this impressive monument. It's just rather strange that some of the most dramatic and beautiful artistic impressions, especially on the interior, we never have construction photos that really detail how those were completed. Well, perhaps nobody wanted to photograph that. It would just simply be boring. We've got 3 very hardworking individuals in a photograph that were clearly shaping the blocks, and that should be good enough for us. And maybe we did indeed construct this. But once again, it's rather odd to think of the fact that we don't build monuments like this anymore. And keep in mind that this was also stated to have been done by a multi-state commission, because again, what else would it be whenever we're looking for an explanation on something like this? I've always found this strange, though, that the largest Doric column just happens to be off of Lake Erie. I mean, I know that, Perry's victory was an incredible moment for an American triumph, and the War of 1812 was the time when the United States really displayed that it was finally a power that was truly free of the control of Great Britain and subsequently the United Kingdom. At least that's what the official history says about it. Again, that very odd war that happened while the Napoleonic Wars were occurring, and for whatever reason was a very indecisive conflict. It also showed that there were limitations in terms of what could be done, but then for whatever reason, large expeditionary forces could be landed overseas and sustained over time. Very interesting icons and symbols, though, that continue to appear on this impressive monument, this monument for victory and international peace. Although, how exactly do you say it's international peace when you're all talking 3 nations? Don't ask me. It's very intriguing, though. Does it give us the impression that perhaps there is some other origin to this particular monument? Maybe these symbols mean something else and have an entirely different explanation behind them. Because I'm always amazed at the fact that we have these symbols that don't seem to match what we would think of as the traditional symbols of, well, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada at that particular time frame. I mean, you can see we've got the 3 modern national flags there hanging up, so I guess that's how we say it's the International Peace Monument, to say nothing of what was actually put on the walls in painstaking detail, and whatever the true materials of it were. And then in this nearby museum at this display, you'll see a more modern statue that depicts the great U.S. naval hero Oliver Hazard Perry himself. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. And yet, once again, you can see that, it's a statue, but you look at the very impressive, tallest Doric column in the world in the background. I mean, yes, it is. It does appear to be made out of blocks, so maybe we did it. But it's, again, just another oddity. Because whenever you look in the interior of these impressive monuments, you again see construction and detailing that seem to be beyond what would have been the expected capabilities at the time. Now again, the explanation is, well, they didn't have bureaucracy, they didn't have safety standards, and people work 6 days a week, or 7 days a week in many cases. They didn't need to eat, they didn't need to defecate, all they did was they worked. They worked, they worked, they worked. They never had any time or consideration for leisure, never mind the fact that we had amusement parks that were very well documented in that time as well, and that's how they were able to complete these very impressive constructions. And in the past, we just simply had more of a paramount importance that we devoted to our national monuments and our state monuments while we're at it, that we could adorn them to be so incredibly beautiful on the exterior, but then in the interior make them accessible to the individual. I always think about how the Sir Walter Scott Monument in Edinburgh in Scotland has an interior walkway and stairways in it, because I guess you need those things. And this is the view of the very surrounding and modest community that you can see from the Perry Monument. So once again, it's a series of questions that, again, don't have many good answers. I mean, you can look at those photos and you can accept the fact that, yes, those photos do very well document the construction of the Perry Monument. I mean, why we don't have a better chronology of photos that show it from start to finish, maybe there were just limitations. But again, going beyond this monument to other cities and communities, such as Duluth off of Lake Superior, there do seem to be many mysteries and anomalies. The rapid formation here of the Canal Zone in Duluth, Minnesota. This particular canal was stated to have been dug out by the good people of Duluth when they didn't want to lose their port and their shipping rights to nearby Superior in Wisconsin. So the people went out with their shovels and they dug out this entire canal zone. Yes, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And that's exactly what we're informed happened. Then, of course, the Army Corps of Engineers showed up because I guess the U.S. government had an interest in making sure that Duluth would be the major port and not Superior, Wisconsin, and that's how they completed this very impressive canal zone. Yes, the aerial lift bridge is quite an engineering wonder as well, and who knows what the real origin on it is. We're assured that we constructed it, and oddly enough, when you look at its origin, it actually wasn't an aerial lift bridge. It was a ferry bridge, and then they converted it into an aerial lift bridge. Very interesting from an engineering point of view. And Duluth has many unique architectural anomalies within it, from Central High School that we've looked at before. And you can look at the foundation of Duluth, another one of these interesting cities that grew up in a very short amount of time off the Great Lakes. And apparently Duluth was so successful that the people of Georgia decided to name one of their new communities after it. And this occurred in the 1870s, right after Georgia was still reeling from Sherman's march, but I guess they got over the Civil War pretty quickly. Whenever you look at these impressive monuments, whether you're in Cleveland or Detroit, you oftentimes see this. This isn't just the Perry Monument, but there's many others that commemorate the Civil War, the war between the states, or the War of the Great Rebellion, or all the other names that we seem to have for it from the 1800s. And you, again, see some very interesting construction materials that are used. You also see an interesting amalgamation of symbols that don't seem to conform or match. It's very intriguing when you think about how this all lines up with the fact that we do have some symbols that we might expect to see that do seem to represent what we think of as the United States at the time, but then we have conflicting symbols that don't seem to match exactly what we're seeing. They seem to represent something else. Now, is it possible that there was still a focus on these particular symbols at the time? I suppose so, but it's always interesting how the more defined depictions of the United States Civil War usually seem to be added on later, and then on the actual monument itself you see conflicting symbols that we'd not expect to see, such as the little wreath and the diamond in the background. What exactly is that supposed to be representing? The Great Union 12th Corps of Ohio? I'm not really sure. But you see this in all the Civil War monuments all across the land. And oddly enough, monuments in other lands where they didn't have a U.S. Civil War do seem to look rather the same. All of this in the Great Lakes area. All of these mysteries, this architecture, these disappearing ships, these strange weather phenomena, these magnetic forces, these sightings of strange aerial phenomenon, or unidentified flying objects, the loss of aviation over time, and other strange things that are observed in and around the Great Lakes. It tells us that there are many more mysteries behind the serenity and beauty. And now let us take a look underneath the surface of the Great Lakes. It's under the surface of the Great Lakes that we find even more strange structural phenomenon, ruins that appear to be sunken. Some people who say that these are the remnants of the Great Lakes' own monolith, if you will, or their own Stonehenge. Now, I haven't actually personally dived and explored these particular ruins, but the fact that they're at the bottom of the Great Lakes is yet another mystery. Is it possible that what we're looking at here is the remnant of some sort of great structure that may have once been part of an apparatus that was part of a greater technology, including magnetic forces over time? Could it have been that the civilization that came before us not only had the power to fashion the Great Lakes artificially, utilizing great means of technology, but they also had the power to change the very magnetic forces that are present in the Great Lakes? Is it possible that the Agonic line is more than simply a line where magnetic north is 0 degrees and there's no declination, but it could actually be a line where realities meet, where we have multiple different physical realities, that there is still the possibility that they overlap because of the fact that this technology is still active in some way, shape, or form? There are many anomalous ruins both above and below the surface in the Great Lakes area. And if you get around to the Great Lakes, whether you're around Lake Superior or Lake Michigan, you'll find that beyond all of these particular ruins, there's no shortage of very impressive and anomalous structures, things that you wouldn't expect to see. Not only are we talking about the lighthouses, we're talking about early forts, early structures, and then of course there's all the impressive, unique, anomalous architecture in the great cities that we've explored, such as Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Duluth, and many others. And so it just continues to overlap all these mysteries that we have with this particular area. For example, this particular terrain feature, this rock formation. We're certainly to understand that this is a natural rock formation according to official sources, and yet when we look at it and study it, we can't help but wonder if there's a little bit more behind it. Is it possible that this could be the remnant of some artificial structure? Of course, we know that that's not to be the case if we accept the mainstream explanation behind things. But there's also the numerous reports of unidentified flying objects, or as we say now, unidentified aerial phenomenon, that are associated with the Great Lakes. Why is it that this is such a confluence of so many different mysteries? You realize that there is much more behind the wonders of the Great Lakes. There are also terrors to behold. Could it be that these are just simply visual anomalies? And when you explore the waters, you'll find no shortage of interesting little land masses such as this, that once again cause you to question if this is really just simply a natural formation. Could this be the remnants of some previous great artificial formation? And you'll find this all over the Great Lakes, whether you're on Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, or Lake Erie. The very strange structures that are both above and below the surface. And going back to the strange weather phenomenon that occur in the Great Lakes. The strange weather phenomenon being used to explain all the shipping losses over the last hundreds of years that have been very well documented and are very well known. Waterspouts and tornadoes that occur, along with the very difficult weather conditions and extreme wind, to say nothing of the Three Sisters or the three rogue waves that'll appear in Lake Superior. Or do they appear in all the Great Lakes? And this is the reason why we have these extensive shipping losses. There's also the unique formation of rather impressive ice patches on the top of the Great Lakes. And you'll find that these ice patches are very aesthetically pleasing and yet oddly symmetrical. Now again, this is a natural phenomenon, but it is a very unique natural phenomenon, where you have formations of ice such as this. I suppose you could say it's much in the same way that a snowflake forms. And yet this is something that seems to be confined to the Great Lakes, where you have ice appearing on the surface in these very impressive natural and symmetrical patterns. Is it possible there may be another explanation behind this? Or, again, is it just simply a natural phenomenon that we just accept? So many intricacies and so many wonders to behold upon the Great Lakes. And whether you visit them in the summer or the winter, spring or the fall, there's always something unique about it. And if you're someone who's more used to swimming in places like the Caribbean, I strongly suggest you get used to immersing yourself in very cold water, as the Great Lakes will no doubt seem very cold to you, even if you go in August. The weather patterns have been well known over years, and yet we have the indication that perhaps the weather patterns are becoming more severe. Yet the official historical account also indicates that the weather patterns have always been severe along the Great Lakes. So is there a definitive reason for this, or is it just because of their unique location? Why is it that we have so many exceptions for the very existence of the Great Lakes? And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that there was actually a cyclone, a hurricane-like storm that did occur over Lake Huron in the mid-1990s. Certainly something that defies all of our expectations, because we'd expect a hurricane to happen somewhere in the ocean, the Caribbean, any one of the gulfs across the land, or the areas where we have hurricanes, but not over Lake Huron. But this really did happen. So is there another reason for this? There's also the rumors of the very unexpected vortexes that have occurred in Lake Ontario. Now, it's intriguing to think that the explanation for these vast shipping losses over the last several hundred years vary between the Great Lakes. Is it all because of odd weather patterns, or is there something else going on? Indeed, there are even rumors that at the bottom of Lake Ontario are some rather enigmatic structures. Again, these structures that may be reflecting the remnants of an apparatus of a previous civilization. Or again, it could just all be an incredible coincidence. But here you see this interesting shoal structure that looks rather artificial in my mind, but maybe it's just my imagination, and again, I haven't actually been down there. And that this is the explanation for the formation of this vortex. Does it have something to do with it on the bottom of Lake Ontario? Or again, is it all just part of that incredible massive coincidence? Looking at some of the land formations in the very coasts of the Great Lakes, you do also witness some rather dramatic changes between how the land alters from the lake to the actual height of it. Or, if you recall looking at the opening video of this particular exploration, you notice that there's some rather interesting rock formations, ridge lines, and a mixture of rubble along with overall great rock. Now again, it could be natural, but one can't simply dismiss the fact that there are many legends that indicate that there were great serpents that once existed in the Great Lakes. Is it possible that the Great Lakes were actually formed artificially in their entirety by this previous civilization? Now, I know this sounds like a very dramatic and far-fetched explanation or theory, but consider the possibility. Mainstream sources indicate that the Great Lakes formed relatively recently in the grand sequence of geological processes. There's also the understanding that if the Great Lakes were formed artificially by a previous civilization, perhaps they had some other reason for doing it. Did it provide this ecosystem that they were trying to nourish certain types of life? Or did they have some other aims entirely that go beyond our ability to explain? Or again, it could just simply be a massive coincidence. Perhaps if you go around Lake Superior on the north side, maybe you'll find a borad wandering around from Carful. And if anybody understands this reference, please let me know in the comments. But looking at the profile of the Great Lakes, we can see how the elevation changes and the depth of each of the lakes. It's intriguing to think of the fact that we haven't actually mapped or understand the bottom of all the lakes, and yet they are relatively deep. Certainly not anywhere as deep as the ocean, so we would expect to have a better understanding of each of the Great Lakes. It's also intriguing when you think of the changes in this elevation going from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes themselves, and how little of an understanding we actually have of what lies beneath the surface. Again, it could just all be a series of coincidences. All coincidences that all just happen to have a confluence in this particular area of land known as the Great Lakes. That these shipping losses were all just the result of bad weather, bad luck, or hard-charging captains, such as the captain of the Edmund Fitzgerald, who is stated to be one of those skippers who took his ship into all kinds of difficult weather conditions. Although one has to ask the question, how exactly does one go about avoiding difficult weather in the Great Lakes if they are beset by difficult weather all the time? When you look at a map such as this, it doesn't seem like the shipping losses are that extensive, but if you recall the earlier maps we look at, they are quite extensive, and they are very well documented in full detail all the way back to the 1600s. So taking it all together, what do we have with the Great Lakes, this land of wonder and this land of terror? Is it possible that there are anomalies and enigmas here that we will never fully explain or understand? Why is it that we had a certain researcher who just happened to be from Racine, Wisconsin, who decided not to even investigate any of these strange mysteries in the Great Lakes? As he was a research librarian, you would think that would have been one of his first considerations to debunk the great mysteries by his homeland. But he decided to focus on the Caribbean for reasons unknown. And that seems to be the situation, that many people do overlook what we have with these mysteries of the Great Lakes, even though this is right in the backyard of both Canada and the United States. There's also the presence of these many impressive lighthouses across all the Great Lakes, such as Split Rock Lighthouse here, vicinity Two Harbors in Minnesota, north of Duluth. Here you have one of these very impressive lighthouses that was constructed, for what we understand, was the warning of navigation for ships on the Great Lakes to prevent shipping losses. And this was purported to have been constructed in the early 1900s, but you can see that there's some very impressive construction in this very isolated area. Indeed, Duluth and Two Harbors are two very interesting communities to explore from an old world perspective. Now again, I will say it's possible we could have constructed this lighthouse in our current civilization, but you can go walk this site today and come to your own conclusions. I've been here, and I will admit that there are some rather unique anomalies with this particular site. Even the quarters for the lighthouse keepers are very well constructed brick establishments. Now, it is possible that they did it and they put all this effort into it, but it's very interesting when you step back and you explore this particular site in person, which I recommend if you have the ability to do that you do. You'll get the idea that it hints at something much more than just simply a lighthouse and some quarters that are located by it. Here we have our construction photo, and once again we have our iron frame construction that always seems to accompany anything with brick and masonry constructions from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Is that really what this is? Why do we have an individual that's just standing on top of that iron frame and not even balancing themselves? It's as though they don't care if they take the fatal plunge. And maybe they didn't. You know, they were working so hard all the time, 6 days a week with only Sunday off, with Sunday spent all day in church, and they walked uphill to school and work both ways. But if you can actually get on site to Split Rock Lighthouse, I advise paying close attention to the natural terrain, and also the break between what we understand to be the lighthouse foundation itself and the natural terrain. They seem to be very well blended together. And that's the mystery that we have, along with the fact that many of these lighthouses are stated to have haunted apparitions with them. Who knows exactly what's going on overall with the Great Lakes? There's so many different visual and physical anomalies to be encountered. Now, of course, you can just simply hand wave it all away and say that it's all a massive coincidence. It just happens to be the only largest freshwater ecosystem in the land that's in the middle of North America. And there's nothing else quite like it anywhere. There are so many different mysteries, so many wonders and terrors that we could explore in much great detail with all the Great Lakes and all the settlements and cities and accounts with them. We could dive underwater and spend endless amounts of time looking at the ruins and trying to find an exact explanation, some sort of understanding for why is it these lakes that, even according to mainstream science, have formed rather recently, have all of these mysteries associated with them. But as always, I leave it to you. It could well be that the mainstream explanation is correct. It could well be that this is just simply a confluence of many different anomalies, shipping losses, strange weather phenomenon, the Agonic line, these sightings of UFOs, all the product of imagination, all in one particular geographical area. Or it could be this really is an area that does have some tremendous significance to it. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Do you think there's anything unique, terrifying, or special with the Great Lakes? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Greetings, Prime Explorers, and I decided from now on we're going to do a Prime Explorer special on Tuesday. Due to the struggles in attempting to upload this video, I attempted 3 times last night, I've decided to greatly expand the subject matter and thought I would take a little bit more time to talk to you this evening, morning, wherever you may be in the land, about the whole concept of unidentified flying objects. And I might be asking, Aurelian, why is this important? Because you've done exactly one video anywhere close to UFOs. It was last summer, and it really wasn't that great of a video. You might recall it was in response to that claim of the face peeler incident down in South America. But it's interesting to note that unidentified flying objects are actually one of the catalysts for what started my interest in alternative research. It wasn't architecture, it wasn't the great lost civilization of Atlantis, it was actually unidentified flying objects. And back in, well, when I was originally studying, and I was a student myself, and I was an undergrad myself, we won't mention how long ago that was, that's what they were called. UFOs, unidentified flying objects. There wasn't this UAP notoriety or anything like that, and there certainly wasn't the open assertion or theories that these were actually celestial objects, or, how shall we say, unidentified celestial objects, or, in other words, objects from undiscovered lands. I mean, really, that's what you're saying, whether you think they're from other planets or other lands, but the distinction's quite intriguing. So let's just recount real quickly the official history of unidentified flying objects. And it's defined in Britannica, which I'm going to use for this exploration, but I'm going to mix like I typically do. So, any aerial object or optical phenomenon not readily identifiable to the observer. UFOs became a major subject of interest following the development of rocketry after World War II, and were thought by some researchers to be intelligent extraterrestrial life visiting Earth. Yes, they do admit that there were official researchers that thought this. Now, this was a theory, and there were many research projects, and it's also interesting to note that this completely deletes the entire account of the late 1800s, early 1900s mystery airship phenomenon. Apparently, those were not UFOs, that was just mass hysteria. But this had a little bit more legitimacy to it. Or are they just trying to play with our minds in terms of what reality is? And it, oddly enough, gets suddenly subverted into flying saucers, with the first well-known UFO sighting occurring in 1947, because remember, according to official history, there really weren't any UFO sightings prior to this. Forget about the mystery airships, and of course forget about all the other sightings from 1910 to 1947. It all started in 1947 with businessman Kenneth Arnold claiming to see a group of 9 high-speed objects near Mount Rainier in Washington. Mount Rainier is a very beautiful area, and I've spent a little bit of time there, especially in the distant past. And he was just flying his small plane, obviously a propeller plane. He was not flying a jet because, didn't really have that at that time yet. And he estimated the speed of the crescent-shaped objects as several thousand miles per hour, and said they moved like saucers skipping on water. And thus the whole flying saucer phenomenon continued. We had the U.S. Air Force with their Project Blue Book, and then all the other concepts of aircraft being stored in places like Dayton, Ohio, and then of course Area 51, Area 52, Area 75, and that strange place in the Mojave. Those of you who were in the military may know what I'm talking about, but frankly it's irrelevant. There was a lot of research that was done on it, and the conclusions were that most of the sightings were easily attributed to astronomical and meteorological phenomenon. Apparently it's very easy for some people to think that the planet Venus is flying, and that's what they'll attribute this to, all these sightings. Yes, it's just the planet Venus. You can easily mistake that. Of course, when you look up Kenneth Arnold himself, it's interesting to note that he was originally born in a little place called Sebeka, Minnesota. I'm probably not even pronouncing it correctly because it is such a small town, and you can see that even the bank in it doesn't actually come across as an old world building. And he was an American aviator, businessman, and ding ding ding, politician. Went to the University of Minnesota and grew up in Montana, just born in Minnesota, and he's known for sighting these aircraft. Now here it states that he estimated they were flying at 1,200 miles per hour. And when you look up the actual image of him, it's interesting they don't have an image of him in Wiki, despite the fact that he was a politician who ran for office. He lost. Make of that what you will. But you can go back and see that they still have accounts of the original report and the original media report that was filed with the news back when this all went down in 1947. And somehow he managed to estimate that these craft, these saucers that he saw, were flying at 1,200 miles per hour. How exactly he estimated that, we're not really sure. I mean, did he use some sort of method? And there are methods to actually measure and get an idea of how fast fixed-wing aircraft are flying, or in this case, saucers, but it's really hard to say. And oddly enough, when you look at another account, they even revised the speed to say that it was even faster. Actually, they were really going 1,700 miles per hour. And maybe that had something to do with the fact that by 1960, the F-4 Phantom was capable of flying 1,200 miles per hour. So maybe it wasn't that fantastic. I don't know. It's all very interesting. And it's very interesting that it's a politician. And of course, we have this image of him gloriously staring up with his camera next to a plane at the flying saucers that he saw. But something else I thought about, this is the interior of an F-4 Phantom, and F-4 Phantom was late 1950s technology. It was the primary U.S. fighter in the Vietnam conflict. The Vietnam War. It was kind of funny how somebody just completely lost their mind that I was drawing a distinction between conflict and war. War is what we do now. War is very controlled. When I was talking about the conflict in the last live stream, I was talking about something that was very uncontrolled and all about total destruction and extermination. We don't have that going on these days. Everything is very controlled. Anyway, when you look at the interior, the cockpit of an F-4 Phantom II, remember that this is late 1950s, early 1960s technology. You'll see the avionics package and the method of control and the radar display. Now, you compare and contrast that with a more modern fighter, such as the F-22, and you see you still have the same control mechanisms, and the only thing that's really changed is you have more of your heads-up display with some more computer displays. And I can attest that it's pretty much the same thing if you're in any sort of armored fighting vehicle in the armed forces, whether it's a M1A1 tank. I dated myself there. Excuse me. We're now up to an M1A3 tank, but it's still the basic platform of tank. And the only thing that's really changed from when they originally fielded it in the early 80s is they've added a few computer screens. And really, that seems to be the only way that fighters have changed. Isn't that interesting? And when you look at the F-35, it's sort of the same thing. And you can see this. Yes, you've got some more readouts, and we've added more digital computer screens. I think of how the control mechanisms have changed over time. Now you're probably asking, okay, what's this got to do with everything? Well, it's interesting to me to think about the development of the technology, because the F-4 was a very fast fighter, and it was even faster, or as fast as those saucers, from Mr. Kenneth Arnold's estimation. Although, again, we're not really told how he estimated the speed. Did he use known point? Well, how did he do that while he was flying himself? Just don't ask, okay? He made an estimate. I understand, at least they're honest about that. But think about the development of aviation technology. When was it really at its pinnacle? Was it really today, or was it actually back in the 1960s? And how accurate is the official history? And something else to think about is the good old Concorde. Just watch Superman 2. On that note, and about the same time as Superman 2, we look at the mainstream's idea of close encounters, or aliens, or flying saucers. And indeed, it was a mainstream movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, released in 1977 by famous director Steven Spielberg. And yes, this was at the height of his powers, really, and pretty much anything he did was considered a blockbuster film, especially in the late 70s, early 80s. Now, you may not have seen this, you may have, and interestingly enough, this actually answers the question of what happened to Flight 19. In fact, the film begins with some scientists in the Sonoran Desert finding Flight 19. And another interesting thing is you might recall the Sonoran Desert is a place of interest that we've covered a lot in our recent explorations. But that's where they finally found it. No sorry, Larry Kush. No sorry, Brian Dunning. No one's ever found Flight 19. This was just a film. It's only been found in a film. But, you can just go today and fly the same course and just claim that you've solved the mystery. We don't ever actually need to find any remains or anything. Not even a single propeller's ever been found, but whatever. Anyways, the reason I highlight this movie is, while it seems like the aliens are somewhat malevolent, in the end they become quite friendly, and the main character, portrayed by Richard Dreyfuss, he suddenly finds himself more and more drawn to find these aliens, to the extent that he abandons his family and then ends up being selected to travel with them. Now, wouldn't it have been interesting if there was something more malevolent about it, and the real reason they were selecting him to travel with them and they were putting these ideas in his mind is so they could experiment on him for all time and all creation. I always thought that was kind of a funny consideration. And yes, it was also a funny saying. I remember when the film came out, one of my teachers actually used that saying, and it stayed with me to this day. Yes, they're going to experiment on him for all time and all creation. Anyways, so this was a little bit more of a benign appearance, but It was also quite mainstream, the concept of UFOs and aliens, and it was fully accepted, and it should be noted this was a very financially successful movie. Budget of $19 million and $300 million in the box office officially, and people still fondly remember this movie, and I do believe it's been selected for preservation as culturally significant. You know, they always do that whenever there's one of these wonderful films, although it's interesting how these older films always seem to be selected. And to be fair to Stephen King in this film in a technical, Steven Spielberg, Freudian slip there. Yeah, Stephen King tried directing a film, Maximum Overdrive. It did not go so well. Back to Steven Spielberg. To be fair to him and the editor, this was a very technically well-made film, as indeed the original Indiana Jones, the first 3 films were. Technically, they were very well-made films. And visually, you'll find that this is a very beautiful film to watch. Now, what's my opinion on it? Ask me in the comments if you're interested. I'm not really here to talk about that this time. Enough talking about films today. But compare and contrast this to the early 1990s film, Fire in the Sky. Now, Fire in the Sky is a little bit of a disjointed film. And that's just me being honest. I will give you my opinion on this one because probably about 85 to 90% of the film is about the logger, Travis Walton, disappearing and his family trying to adjust to it. And then, of course, investigator played by good old James Gardner is trying to figure out what's going on. And most of the film is that drama. And frankly, it's, rather mundane. But the end of the film, when you have Walton's flashback of the alien abduction experience, it's kind of a wonderful horror film. And that scene is very well done, and it's still remembered to this day. Another little interesting note is that Fire in the Sky was written by Tracy Torme, who was a writer for Star Trek The Next Generation and was extensively involved in the first and the second season. Gene Roddenberry liked him, but showrunner Maurice Hurley did not like Tracy Torme, and oftentimes fiddled with the scripts. If you remember the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation in the episode Conspiracy, Tracy Torme was the author of that. And to this day, many fans of Star Trek The Next Generation consider that the best episode of the first season. Of course, it's a matter of opinion. But Torme was known for trying to push things and break the status quo. Although, ironically, that happened to be the trap that Star Trek The Next Generation did fall into, even once the show became really good after the Best of Both Worlds. In fact, things sort of maintained status quo until the end. Still a good show, don't take me wrong. But what's intriguing is compare and contrast this depiction of aliens and Fire in the Sky and Close Encounters, and consider what you have with this mentality of these aliens. Now, do these aliens really exist? Are they from other worlds? Are they visitors from other lands? Are they from other dimensions? Are they from other realities? Or is it all just the product of our imagination? Once again, ambiguity seems to be the real mention behind it. Now, like I said, to refer back to my interest in alternative research, I was very interested in UFOs. I saw all these movies, I was big into science fiction at the time, and I read all these books about alien abductions, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. Well, now we go to 2000, late November in 2000, and a younger Lucius Aurelian was driving back to Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, to give a guest lecture at that time. And I was driving on Highway 30, and I remember exactly where I was. I was between the towns of Tama, Toledo, which is actually called the Twin Cities. You know, I have the Meskwaki Cultural Center and Museum. The Meskwaki Indian tribe is present there, and they also have a really nice casino off of Highway 30. I've never been there. Gambling's not exactly my thing. But while I was driving past there, before I'd reached the town of La Grande, I remember exactly where I was, and I was just south of where the Iowa River runs, and there's a bit of a ridge line north of it, and I was westbound. And I can even tell you exactly where I was on the road, which is a little bit disturbing. So this is heading westbound, and it was right when I came to this clearing here, and I suddenly noticed, and remember that this is November in Iowa, late November. There aren't any thunderstorms in Iowa. There's no lightning storms in Iowa in late November. At least I'd never experienced any. And that's quite a few years you're talking about. And when I got up to this little shed, and I don't recall if this was there yet or not, and I was probably about a mile short of the town of La Grande, and I suddenly saw this lightning, and it was really odd, looking back here to this ridgeline. So I'm looking back at what would be the 5 o'clock position from the direction of travel, or looking in the general direction of northeast. And it was right along this ridgeline, that I saw this interesting ball. A sphere would probably be the better way to describe it. Now, when I saw it, it came right up over the ridgeline, and from my perspective, it was probably about 2 times the diameter of the moon. It was quite large. And there's never been a picture I can find. I've looked up ball lightning because that's what I thought it was. It seemed like it was the phenomenon of ball lightning. Even though it was late November in Iowa, it made no sense. And I could never find any sort of picture that looked remotely like it. And I really can't even describe it to you. I mean, it was something incredibly unique. There was something ethereal about that object that was right there by the ridgeline. Something about it that didn't make any sort of sense. And to this day, I don't have any idea what it was. I am not under the impression it was any kind of craft. But I've oftentimes considered the theory that the whole reason we have all the UFOs and conflicting reports and conflicting accounts is just to keep us confused. There may well be something out there. There could be objects from some other reality, some other dimension. Or maybe it is just the fact that it could just be a cover-up for the government to really test some of this more advanced craft that they have. Maybe even technology from the previous civilization. I mean, what makes more sense? If we see it looking at the concept of the old airships, and then you look at technology that's gradually being repurposed, redeveloped, and implemented back into service, what does make the most sense? And why is it we seem to reach the pinnacle of our aviation technology across the land in the 1960s? And you can actually find a lot of evidence that supports that conclusion. Now, of course, you can make counter arguments that the technology was suppressed, the Cold War ended, there was no need to continue to develop aviation technology, or thrust vectoring is the end-all, be-all in modern aviation with fighters. Fine, so be it. Whatever you want to think. But it is intriguing when you look at these conflicting accounts and you're trying to explain, what the heck was this object I saw? Now, maybe you think I'm just crazy, maybe I didn't see anything. I certainly wasn't drinking at the time, and I wasn't doing anything at the time that would cause me to hallucinate, at least nothing I was aware of consciously. But I did see it, and to this day I can't explain it, and I wanted to share it with you. So by all means, what do you think I saw in the comments? Was it some sort of ethereal object? Was it something from another reality, another dimension? Did I pass through some sort of gateway as I was driving westbound on Highway 30 before I got to the very large town of LeGrand? And you might recall I have spent some time back in this area of Iowa doing some explorations, because there were explorations done in Tama, Toledo. We actually took a look at Toledo, and we looked at the Marshalltown Courthouse. You might recall that's the courthouse that was tornado-proof. It took a direct hit from an EF4 tornado, and all it took off was the cheap cupola they threw up in the 1970s. The old world building, not a scratch on it. Some of the windows were blown out, but those weren't the original windows either. So anyway, make of that what you will, and I know that's a lot to cover with all of this research concerning these UFOs, or unidentified aerial phenomenon as they call them now, but what's really going on? Is there more to this story? Did I actually see anything? And to be fair, none of these things that you see out here were around in the early 2000s. I mean, this part of Iowa's kind of grown up and developed a little bit, namely with this Meskwaki casino right here, or Native American. When I say Indian, that's actually what they call it on the ground there. So, not trying to offend anybody. Last but not least, I thought as a little bit of a bonus I would cover this secret tomb containing remains of 12 skeletons discovered at Petra site in Jordan. Now, you might recall we've done some earlier live streams concerning the site in Petra. It's featured prominently in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, another Steven Spielberg movie, and a very technically well-made movie, and an enjoyable movie in my mind. And by the way, they were after the Holy Grail in that film, apparently an object I can't talk about for whatever reason, but that's okay. Anyways, it's interesting, and I wanted to share this with you concerning archaeologists have discovered a secret tomb at the Treasury Monument in Petra, Jordan, one of the 7 wonders of the world. I might say it's a little bit more than that. A long-buried tomb containing the remains of 12 ancient skeletons and grave offerings. Now, you have to ask yourself this question: how exactly did they just suddenly find a tomb in this area that's been a UNESCO World Heritage Site for some time? I mean, it's been quite some time since they filmed Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I mean, that was the late 1980s. So, I mean, how far do we need to go here? 30, 40 years? And they're just now finding this tomb? And one of the interesting things on the explorations that I never see anybody bring up, and I think it's because somehow, in some way, the powers that be have knowledge that I do know about archaeological processes and procedures, because no one has ever made a comment trying to flick that nerve. Of course, now that I said it, even in a Prime Explorer video, watch, there'll probably be 10, 20 comments about it. That's okay. I'm prepared for it. But anyway, here's what they say. British and American researchers from the University of St. Andrews, the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, and the American Center of Research, so we have a lot of Americans and British involved here, have been given permission to conduct remote sensing in and around the monument. You know, because it's not like they haven't been given permission before many times. And that's the reason you'll be given. There's some sort of bureaucratic reason. There's some sort of political reason for why we can't do this. And now we've got this great technology, and now we can find all these things we somehow didn't find earlier. Nice picture that just shows them going to work right in front of the main entrance. Gee, nobody thought to look there, did they? And what you have with this, and the reason why I'm sharing this is all very, very dubious. We have these sites that our attention is directed to, and it always seems like we're finding more things. We found a new burial chamber. We found more scrolls here and there. We're always finding more history, and it's going to tell us about the history of this kingdom. And you might remember when we covered this that these people were nomads who just decided to park here and build this mighty structure. And that's what the official historical account says. And rest assured that everything that these archaeologists find are going to support that conclusion, because that is fact, and there is no challenging fact. Like Carl Sagan said, it's a fact. It really happened. And yes, if you want to fling Aurelian's nerves, that's a good way to do it. In a bit of a comical way, because archaeologists found the walls within the tomb were dated to between the mid-1st century BC and the early 2nd century AD. Yeah, if you're interested, ask me in the comments how that really goes when it comes to dating and carbon dating. It's quite intriguing. And if you're also interested, ask me what you think about my little dissertation that I did on this particular area. It's quite fascinating. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this exploration, and like I said, I intend to devote a little bit more time and jump around to a few different topics for Prime Explorers every Tuesday from here on out. Thank you for joining me, and look forward to hearing from you in the comments. Thank you.